What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode on the channel. Part 4 of What If a Serial Killer Reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman. If you are enjoying the series, please for me like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. With that, guys, enjoy. POV narration. The compound of the Dark Brotherhood quickly grew in the next few months, and their budget also suddenly grew as they were able to finally count the amount of wealth Ken had actually stolen. Several Saburo did actually burst out laughing at the same time when he realized that Ken had somehow stolen the entirety of the Grass Village's funds that had been gathered for over a decade. To him, it was just funny, though he did also realize that the Grass Village was likely never going to forgive them in any way. The good part about that was that neither Ken nor anyone working for him really gave a shit about the Grass Village anymore. Ken being strong enough to take the entire village on really just spoke for itself at that point. And not even the orphans/recruits seemed to be scared at the prospect of their leader angering a hidden village. If anything, they were actually excited to hear about his exploits. Tosho was rather disappointed that the children were no longer admiring him as much, but he did understand that Ken was worthy of their admiration as well. Besides gaining a large budget and expanding with a few more buildings, this time, they even managed to invite an actual good construction crew to remodel and make adjustments to the current buildings as well. It wasn't that Tosho had done a bad job, but it wasn't as if he was an experienced builder. Every home, and especially the leader's abode, was remodeled to fit with their new expanded budget. Saburo did plan to kill them after they finished their jobs to protect the location and knowledge of their base, but Ken made it clear that Saburo would follow them to the grave if anything happened to them, which took that idea out of the strawman's head. In the end, they decided to simply pay the men for their silence. It was likely only a temporary fix, but the blind swordsman was okay with it. Ken decided to spare no expense and give the recruits the best accommodation and food possible, the type that would make middle-class families blush. The blind swordsman only really cared about training being harsh after all. He didn't believe that his recruits also needed to sleep on the hard floor or eat weeds, though he did incorporate sleeping on a stone floor as training. At least 1 week per month, he believed it would be good for the recruits to get used to sleeping in any environment. The Dark Brotherhood was advancing more and more, with more orphans gathering than before, now at the prospect of joining a brotherhood instead of a nameless organization of assassins. Suddenly, Tosho's orphanage scouring across the Land of Iron and nearby areas became a lot easier, with him managing to surpass his goal and increase the number of recruits to a whopping 86 in a mere few months. Although, that number was bound to stop growing for a time, as Tosho had already exhausted the avenues he was using for recruitment. They only handpicked orphans under the age of 10, so they were all children easy to build rapport with, and easy to gain the loyalty of, as long as they were treated well, of course. But that was never an issue, as Ken's organization presented the recruits with human rights that were very much above the usual standards that hidden villages provided. Some certainly complained about the difficulty of the training, but at the end of the day, they all were allowed to leave whenever they wanted. They were given the choice of becoming something more than just victims of a prolonged war. Their wills were strengthened by their losses and life experiences. Besides a surplus of recruits, the Dark Brotherhood also gained a stable source of income in the form of Saburo's clones, hunting bounties of bandits. The strawman was more than glad to send some of his Jonin clones to hunt down notorious bandit groups. He was also more than capable enough to engage in several fights at the same time, so all was well as long as he didn't run into any annoying enemies. The fact that they were situated in the Land of Iron also helped a bit, as it was a neutral land and somewhat filled with bandits because of that. That meant that the Daimon was always putting up bounties for new bandit groups in the area, and the Dark Brotherhood was more than happy to collect them all. Tough Ken did provide a rule that they weren't going after groups of deserters unless they had more crimes on their record. Even then, Saburo's clones would have to stalk them for a bit to verify their guilt. It seemed that Ken had a soft spot for deserters. Saburo could somewhat understand it. They were after all just numbers to their leaders. Some would obviously reach the conclusion that dying for a worthless cause was foolish. Alas, there were plenty that also just wanted to profit off the war and the common folk. Those were actually the Dark Brotherhood's prime targets. Saburo was a bit annoyed by the extra steps he had to take in vetting groups, but he did need to respect orders. The Dark Brotherhood now also had a more concrete internal structure, with Ken as the leader, the head of the organization. Many of the orphans had also taken to calling him father. Ken didn't complain, and the name started to stick in the minds of the recruits. His costume remained unchanged, as he didn't see any need to change it. Tosho, Akira, and Saburo were part of the leadership, part of Ken's retainers. They were called the Blades. They all had similar costumes. Tosho's remained unchanged, while Saburo got a mask with 2 small red lions in the middle, and Akira got one with 3. Each of them was to lead departments of their own and grow as the strongest in the organization besides Ken himself. Then, after the Blades, there were the Numbered, a ranking system based on strength inside the Brotherhood. Each department would have its own rankings, of course. Currently, the only Numbered in the organization was Saburo's clones, belonging to the research department, which also acted as a bounty hunting department, at least for now. They were wearing regular thin black clothing with long black coats that covered their bodies. All of their faces were covered by completely white masks, slightly obstructed by large straw hats. The recruits were still not part of the system. They were only given regular training garb and clothes. They were to become numbered upon graduating from their training, later to be delegated into different departments of their choice. There were still many things that Ken planned out for the Dark Brotherhood, but he'd first have to wait and train the current batch of recruits that the organization had. Now, Ken wasn't dumb, neither was Saburo or Tosho. Akira was arguably the least intelligent among them, but even he caught on rather quickly. All of their actions, all of their current exploits and rapid growth basically gave away their exact position and announced to the world that they were there in the Land of Iron. Ken, however, didn't care about their base location being found out. He knew that it was impossible to keep it a secret, especially since he had no way for the Dark Brotherhood to be self-sufficient. When it came to food in the short term, Ken knew that he needed to establish clear trade routes to arrange for and create a proper marketplace at some point. Farming would only become feasible down the line, so the Dark Brotherhood was going to only be able to gain its food through trade, which wouldn't be possible as their organization grew. He had planned to build a secret organization at first, but after finding out that it would be near impossible to keep it a secret, he decided that he would go all in and create an entire village. Not a village of commoners, mind you, a village inhabited only by the Dark Brotherhood's trained assassins. Every merchant that came and went would be from the Dark Brotherhood. Every farmer would also work part-time as an assassin. All of them would be adopted and raised inside the Brotherhood, and all of them would learn and develop as assassins first. As their talents developed, they would get the chance to go into different fields. It was going to take a long time, but Ken was sure that it was possible. He slowly started putting a framework in place. His end goal, well, that was a bit more complicated. Ken wanted at first to have eyes in the world, so it was going to act as an informational network. But there was also something else. Seeing the damage of the war on those orphans, Ken grew more and more disappointed in the world he found himself in. But he also knew that it wasn't possible to change it, to change humans in general. So, he would have to at least provide a safe haven for all of the children affected by the war. To all those willing to join him and grow stronger. Talented or not, they all had a right to a better life, and Ken was going to provide it for them. But that would take years, many years to develop and reach everyone throughout the world. For now, Ken needed to focus on the present as well. Akira was actually the first one to point out that the Daimyo of the Land of Iron would certainly send his men to check out the place and probably even collect taxes. Even the construction company was only aware that they were helping build a village, so Ken expected the Daimyo to treat them like a new community at first. Saburo seemed to also be a bit curious about how Ken would decide to interact with the Daimyo, as it was definitely going to be crucial to the future of the Dark Brotherhood. If he does agree to pay taxes, then the Dark Brotherhood would essentially become the Land of Iron's hidden village. But if he doesn't, then even a war could become a possibility. Ken may be strong, but facing off against 10,000 trained samurai and retainers isn't feasible, at least not yet, maybe in a few years. The strawman had already judged Ken's power, and did know where exactly on the scale to put him. He was simply on the level of an actual cage, someone from the large villages. When it came to power and fighting strength, he seemed to be weaker than the Reikage in both speed and defense, but the two of them seemed to have similar styles. It's hard to tell how a fight between them would end though. Er is still stronger than Ken, by a rather large margin as well. He is more durable and has more power in general, but Ken's potential for growth is much larger. At least, that was the conclusion the strawman had reached after the incident in the grass village. Ken sensed his retainers, and could feel the worry seeping from Akira, as well as the curiosity emanating from Saburo. I don't plan to pay any taxes to the Land of Iron. This village is built in a deserted and rather inhospitable mountain range, and all of it was made using our own resources. The leader made his stance clear, and Saburo couldn't help but nod, agreeing with the decision and the logic behind it. Still, he hoped that Ken was prepared for the repercussions. Alas, Saburo was prepared to turn tail and run at any moment if the situation looked truly unwinnable. so he was okay with whatever choice Ken made as long as he could continue getting support on his research. Though, his research was postponed for a bit as his laboratory was still under construction. Still, doesn't that mean that they'll try to kill us all? Akira decided to simply voice out his worries once more, being the more honest of the ones present. Akira still felt like he owed Ken a lot. The blind swordsman was really the only reason he was even alive. He had already decided that he'd stick with him till the end. To him, Ken's fate was his fate, so his worry was well justified. The daemon will certainly try something, but I will first have a talk with him. I will set up a meeting when he eventually sends his men here. Don't worry, I'll handle everything. Ken, once again, didn't seem very concerned about the daemon. He simply relaxed and stretched in his chair a bit, pointing at some reports on the table as Akira helped him read them. The situation with the daemon was bound to end in a bad way, regardless of what Ken chose. So the blind swordsman was going to have to do what he knew best, and make sure that his village was well protected as it grew. After reading a few reports, Akira eventually reached the subject of techniques. The reserve that the Dark Brotherhood had was still rather pitiful when compared with a hidden village, but they did thankfully still have plenty of jutsu to teach to their younglings. They even had the secret techniques of the grass village, though those also required a bloodline from what Ken was able to hear, so they turned out to be pretty useless for now. Saburo himself was also able to impart a few techniques to them, which certainly helped, but it wasn't for free, of course. Everything that Saburo did was a transaction, so in exchange, he was taught the technique that Ken used to hide his presence as well. Saburo was genuinely shocked after learning about it and the way it worked. It was well and truly demented, requiring an almost insane level of dedication and hard work to gain even a little bit of mastery over it. It involved gaining absolute control of one's bodily functions, of every sense and organ in the human body. The technique consisted of slowing down one's heartbeat to an unnatural extent, lowering the body's temperature down to dangerous levels. The training involved rapid and constant changes in the environment, oftentimes jumping from heavy training inside saunas to training under a cold waterfall or inside a cold ice bath in the span of a few seconds. Such changes would oftentimes cause a high risk of cardiac arrest. It was bearable for already trained shinobi though. Alas, the recruits would only start training after gaining a proper base as regular assassins. Such harsh training would otherwise kill them at such a fragile age. It was a technique that Ken had come up with in his previous life, in his rather long career as the best assassin in the world. He could use that method to easily slip by most detection methods with ease, including infrared and night vision. As long as he was dressed appropriately, he really could sneak in just about everywhere. The technique wasn't perfect. However, Ken was unable to pass through the highest levels of security undetected. The latest models and security systems in his old world would detect and snap at even the smallest blade of grass moving with the wind, so a human sneaking by would easily be noticed. Still, Ken was able to do every job thanks to his fighting skills as well, killing countless people, and going through a lot of hardships to hone his skills. In his current life, Ken was able to further perfect that technique with the discovery of chakra and nature energy, making his technique essentially perfect, making him almost impossible to ever spot. Eventually, Ken even decided to give it a name. Simple and self-explanatory, presence control through mastery and constant training allowed the user to have a near-perfect mastery over their presence, thanks to nature energy. The blind swordsman was able to do a lot more than just hide his presence perfectly. He also managed to affect the surroundings with his aura. He used that before mainly to spark fear into the hearts of his enemies before the battle. Alas, he couldn't teach others how to use nature energy. He himself didn't have the greatest understanding of what it was. So, at most, they would have a weaker version of presence control. That was what Tosho learnt was still training in, and what Akira was currently struggling to learn. Saburo was excited to get to learn it as well, but he became disappointed that he likely would have difficulty using it with his clones as well. The technique involved exact control over one's own body. The amount of concentration it would take would be too much for it to be done on multiple bodies at once. The strawman was on his own there, as Ken was not all that familiar with the clone technique he was using. As Saburo stood and pondered on how to use presence control alongside his clones, the door to Ken's office swung open, and Tosho walked inside in a rather hasty manner. "Sorry for intruding, leader, but there are people outside insisting to speak with the leader of the village." Tosho sounded a bit annoyed, probably having gotten into a bit of an argument with said visitors. "The Daimyo's delegation has already arrived. News sure travels fast." POV narration. The Daimyo of the Land of Iron, Harada Yuchi, didn't simply sleep on the news of a strange village popping up in the middle of a mountain range in his territory. Even if it was on the border, it still fell under his jurisdiction. He did learn that the ones that helped build it were paid handsomely. Upon interrogating one of the workers, he learnt a bit more about the people occupying it. Shinobi, as well as children that seemed to be victims of the war. It was a concerning situation for the Land of Iron. The first thought that came to mind was that deserters from the Second Shinobi War had decided to create a new village in the Land of Iron to provide a home for the ones that had their lives ruined by the war. Yuchi couldn't quite bring himself to respect deserters and shinobi, but he actually found the idea a bit heartwarming. However, he didn't want to get involved in a dispute with any of the hidden villagers regarding the shinobi that had taken refuge in his country. That was why Yuichi had decided to send a delegation to the sprouting community to see what exactly was their deal and understand what course of action he should take. As much as I like the idea of war orphans having a home, I don't want it to be done at my expense. I need to find out where this village gets its funding, and whether or not it's a threat to national stability. If it isn't and they've managed to help our country, then they should at least pay taxes like any other village. That was the thought process of the daimon. At the end of the day, if the community was to contribute to the country, he didn't care if they were former shinobi. He would be willing to tell the hidden villagers to fuck off if the need arose. There was, however, the possibility that they were actually spies sent by one of the hidden villages, but it seemed unlikely. None of the hidden villagers had anything to gain from aiming for the Land of Iron. The Land of Iron was mostly a mountainous region. All of their castles and cities were easy to defend, and all of their soldiers were used to the terrain and cold temperatures. Back in the warring era, many clans had tried to take the Land of Iron only to be forced to back away by samurai, determined to defend their homes. Many warriors had distinguished themselves at that time, their families now part of the nobility in the Land of Iron. They weren't afraid of any of the other lands surrounding them, even if they were smaller in size. After all, from reports, none of the shinobi were wearing any headbands, meaning they had abandoned any loyalty they once had with their former villages. The delegation he sent was comprised of one Hakoshu, a noble appointed by the shogun, and two Hatamoto, banner carriers that were there to protect the noble messenger in his quest. They were there specifically to invite the leader of the community to meet with the daimon. The noble was there to represent the Land of Iron's honest intentions. The delegation was greeted at the gate. It was newly constructed, and a small wooden fence surrounded the small village from what they could see. There were two masked men guarding the gate, standing eerily still, and not moving even an inch as they waited on the orders of their leader. The Hakoshu had already been greeted by a person wearing a different mask, one with a red line down the middle. Their conversation hadn't gone quite well. "You want to summon our leader to your castle. Of course, it's only customary that a landowner greets the true ruler of the lands he occupies." "True ruler? Huh," Tosho said mockingly as he shook his head a bit. The delegate scowled a bit when sensing the disdain in the masked man's voice. "Watch your mouth when speaking of the daimon. You are currently in the Land of Iron. You shall treat its ruler with respect." The Hakoshu spoke with a confident and accusatory tone. He didn't appreciate his superior's name being taken in vain, nor did he appreciate Tosho's disrespectful nature. Alas, Tosho, who had lived as a poor peasant for the better part of 2 decades, didn't have much respect for the rich ruling class. "Whatever, I'll inform our leader of your presence. You can speak to him yourself." Tosho simply waved his hand and turned around. The Hakoshu wanted to admonish the masked retainer when hearing his dismissive tone. Tosho's back disappeared before he had the chance to. The Hakoshu and the Hatamoto wanted to enter the village then, but the two guards simply raised their palms. "We shall escort you to the leader's compound," one of the masked guards said as it gestured for the delegation to follow him. At that point, the Hakoshu simply nodded respectfully. He was displeased with the fact that this leader hadn't come out to greet them, but he appreciated being escorted inside nonetheless. The inside of the village looked quite beautiful even by the Hakoshu's standards. It was clear that it was built with quite a large budget, and in the distance, he and the Hatamoto were able to see dozens of children happily training and walking around, watched over by masked men that looked similar to the guards. The delegation immediately became tense as they realized a rather chilling fact. They're training children to become shinobi. They knew that they needed to report the matter to the daimon with haste. The community that they were visiting now was clearly not just a regular village, and every resident seemed to either be a masked shinobi or a child still in training. "Building a hidden village in our territory, this spells trouble." The Hakoshu gulped a bit as he looked at his surroundings. The guard leading them was just as quiet as before. In fact, none of the adults seemed to be talking or conversing in any way. It was as if they were just wardens. At least the children don't look to be mistreated. That was the one redeeming factor in all of that. The Hakoshu noticed how they all seemed to be wearing new clothes, and all of them seemed to be well fed. Even better, to the side, he could see one of the masked guards cooking a large pot of warm stew. The Hakoshu could clearly see that there was a lot of meat inside that stew. At the very least, these are people we may be able to talk to overall. It gave both the two Hatamoto and the Hakoshu a decent impression of the village. That didn't change the fact that they all detested how the shinobi started training their young though. Eventually, the delegation reached a large building, which seemed to be more akin to a mansion with a wooden structure and a tiled roof. There were 2 more guards stationed at the entrance, which greeted the delegation with a nod before showing them inside. The halls inside reminded the Hakoshu of his own home. Large and spacious, spotless and clean, while also being well lit and decorated. It's clear that this leader knows how to live. It was rather impressive after all. The village was starting to look less like a village, and more like a compound with a mansion housing a stray noble. The faces of the delegation changed as soon as they entered the room of the leader though. Two more guards at the door opened it for them, allowing them to enter. The leader sat in a chair, his spiky long black hair flowing behind him as he sat down with his legs crossed. The man wore a black coat that covered most of his body, just like all of the other adults in the compound. But the delegation instantly noticed something different. His white mask had a large red dot in the center, one that sent shivers down their spines. Shit, why is this man here? The short man was currently the most famous bounty hunter. The madman had attacked a hidden village unprovoked and brought it to its knees. He was both dangerous and unpredictable. In that instant, the delegation felt as if the situation was just going to take a turn for the worst. The Hatamoto by his side also immediately tensed up, their hands trembling as if they prepared to reach for their blades. The red dot wasn't even alone in the room. By his side stood two people, all dressed the same as him, but their masks all had a different number of lines on them instead of a dot. Greetings, representatives of the Land of Iron. The bounty hunter's voice broke out first, relieving some of the tension in the room, at least momentarily, with his polite tone. The Hakoshu even sighed in relief when hearing that. Unlike Tosho, Ken seemed to be respectful at the very least. Greetings. I must apologize for the prolonged silence. I was a bit taken aback by your presence. The Hakoshu decided to simply calm down and carry out his mission. He was just a messenger at the end of the day. It was unlikely for him to be killed off for no reason. As long as he acted with respect, the Hakoshu believed he would be just fine. The Hatamoto at his side were also trained enough to know when acting was a bad choice, so they both chose to remain completely silent. I can understand how my presence may be a bit off-putting, especially with the rumors that have been circling around lately. However, I assure you that you are in no danger currently. I do not wish to make an enemy out of the Land of Iron. At that point, the Hakoshu was completely relieved. Not only was the red dot nothing like the rumors, but he was also polite and well-spoken, a man that knew his way around diplomacy, at the very least. I am glad to hear that. However, I am afraid that the daemon wouldn't quite agree with you building a hidden village here. The noble decided to also address the elephant in the room, after realizing that Ken was someone he could converse with. Oh, I can assure you that we are not building a hidden village. This is merely the compound of my bounty hunting organization. It hasn't been established for long, but I was planning on getting in contact with the daemon myself. Ken decided to not tell the whole truth in the end. He didn't feel that the Land of Iron needed to learn of his intentions and aspirations for now. I'm a bounty hunting organization. That is quite unheard of. I guess you will have to speak to the daemon directly regarding the rights to build such a thing in his territory. The delegation still didn't seem completely convinced by Ken's answer, but they weren't quite willing to challenge him directly. I am sure we will be able to come to an agreement regarding that. Regardless, this organization is only funded and built through the money we make from hunting bounties and killing threats to the Land of Iron. I doubt the daemon will be unable to see the benefits of keeping such an organization around. Ken's answer was just as polite as before, constructed well, almost as if he had already been expecting them, and had thought of exactly what to say beforehand. I am able to see the benefits of such a thing. I am sure the daemon will also be curious to learn more. I am here to formally extend an invitation to you. The daemon wishes to meet you in person in his castle. You may come at your own convenience, but please try to make haste. I am sure you understand that this is a rather delicate matter. The Hakoshu placed a small scroll on the table in front of Ken as he spoke, wanting to quickly complete his mission, so that he could leave the compound/village. Of course, I shall start making my way there this week. Thank you for delivering this message to us. The red dot simply nodded, not bothering to extend his hand and read the letter in front of the delegation. The Hakoshu felt that it was a bit disrespectful of him, but decided not to say anything as Ken had been quite polite up to that point. Of course, it's been a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance, Red Dot. The Hakoshu bowed slightly before preparing to take his leave. A pleasure indeed. Ken nodded a bit, before turning his head to the side of one of his retainers. Second Blade, please make sure to escort these men out of the compound. The delegation watched. The man that wore a mask with two lines simply nodded and walked to their side. There's no need. The delegation wanted to leave the village anyway, but they didn't exactly feel safe walking around with one of the Red Dot's retainers. Think of it as me showing my sincerity. We shall speak again at the palace. Ken didn't bother to hear them out anymore, simply gesturing for them to leave. The Hakoshu wanted to protest once more, but decided against it, and simply looked at his men and started leaving. As soon as they left the room, Ken sighed. Rather annoying. Huh, Tosho said as he looked at his leader with a side glance. Maybe, but it is something we would have had to deal with eventually. The blind leader shrugged a bit. "This doesn't feel quite right. I think you should take us with you when you visit the castle," Akira said as he scratched his chin a bit. "There is no need to overcomplicate things. I can always escape if I find out they're planning something. Besides, this doesn't feel much like a trap, at least not a physical one." The leader simply shook his head, placing his mask on the table, raising his head high and taking a deep breath. "They will certainly try something if you don't agree to submit to them, but your reputation might make them reconsider taking action." Tosho was also a bit unsure when speaking. He wasn't quite used to politics either, so he was mostly going by what his gut was telling him. "Regardless of what they attempt, I'll at the very least hear them out." Ken smiled a bit, revealing his sharp teeth and canines to his two retainers. "We are still preparing for that mission though, so this isn't exactly ideal timing," Tosho said as he turned his head and looked at a billboard on the wall. It was filled with different pictures, currently obscured by a screen to their visitors, only visible from the leader's chair. On the billboard were the pictures of 7 people, all impaled with knives on that wall. "Indeed, but there is no hurry. We'll get to it after training our current set of recruits, which might take another 2 years." Ken simply shrugged. "Indeed. I guess you'll really have to reach an understanding with the Land of Iron then." Saburo also walked back in at this time, already knowing what the discussion was about from the clones that stood at the door. "I doubt it'll be that difficult. This compound is sure to have left a rather good impression on the delegation. It was a good choice for you to give the children a break from training and to start cooking with the windows open when they arrived, of course. Thank you for noticing my efforts," though some of the children still continued training. Hardworking seedlings, the lot of them. Saburo simply bowed slightly, smiling a bit under his mask. "I guess you can't really hide anything from this child's eyes, huh? As a reward for your carefully planned presentation of our organization, I'll make sure to put a bit more funding into the laboratory. At the very least, hurry its completion so that you may be able to restart your research." Ken didn't seem to pay any mind to Saburo's thanks. He instead decided to just give the man a tangible reward, a carrot on a stick for him to continue performing. That was the only strategy that would truly ever work with someone like the strawman. Saburo was aware of the way Ken thought about him, and he was pleased that he didn't need to bother hiding his intentions around the blind child. The strawman simply smiled and nodded when hearing that he would be able to restart his research sooner. After all, he had placed everything on hold in order to help Ken with the Dark Brotherhood. Of course, they then continued going over a few papers, including the invitation from the Land of Iron's leader. Tosho also went to train the children. There were a lot of them now, so Saburo's clones were assisting him with the training as well. The next few days flew by quickly, and Ken eventually left his office with a smile on his face. Time for diplomacy. POV narration. The Land of Iron was structured in a rather strange way. Unlike the other territories, it wasn't outright ruled just by the daimon and the cage of its respective hidden village. However, just like any of the other nations, in the Land of Iron, the daimon acted as the political leader of the country. As a strict and honor-ruled society, the Land of Iron saw shinobi with disdain, and considered their assassination techniques and jutsu to be nothing more than petty tricks. The samurai in the Land of Iron relied only on kenjutsu, or sword techniques and fighting styles, that coupled well with their chakra blades. A big part of why they could maintain their neutrality was their military strength. Each samurai was also much stronger than regular shinobi, which gave them an advantage on the world stage. But the leader of the armies was also a figure that could protect their country if push came to shove. The general and samurai warrior, Mifune. He had even been told to have fought Hanzma the Salamander and survived. He had actually won Hanzo's respect, only losing because his blade had broken during the battle. Their fight was nothing more than a simple skirmish, while the general was away on a mission near Omegaka or the village hidden in the rain. Even if he lost in the end, that fight had cemented Mifune as a powerful samurai, and had proved to everyone once again that the Land of Iron was not to be trifled with. This was all the more reason why the daimon, Harada Yoichi, was having trouble understanding why shinobi had decided to set up camp in their territory. After all, besides Mifune, there were also plenty of Hatamoto more than capable of fighting and killing even Jonin. Only after his delegation returned with a report that he had grasped the situation a bit more. The Red Dot. He was basically the only person in the world that could pull something like that off. Yoichi was a bit relieved when hearing that the Red Dot was only building an organization, and not a full-on hidden village. But that didn't mean he was all that happy about not being consulted at all regarding the mountain range, said the organization now occupied. Alas, the Red Dot did have the strength to just take whatever territory he desired, at least unless any of the 5 Great Cage decided to speak up against him. In a sense, any of the 5 Cage would also be able to take up whatever territory they wanted if they were to be rogue shinobi. But they were all affiliated with their respective hidden villages and directly under the political jurisdiction of their land's daimon. The Red Dot was a powerful figure not affiliated with any of the daimon and not under the jurisdiction of any power. That was what made him dangerous. That was also why plenty of the daimon and cage wanted him to disappear. He had gained a lot of fame and notoriety too quickly, which took the world by surprise. but only ended up putting a target on his back in the end. At least that was what Yuichi had figured out when reading reports about him. But now his movements were starting to make more and more sense, the bounty hunter's intentions becoming clearer and more transparent. From reports, he could have easily never been seen during his missions. This means that he was specifically always looking to increase his reputation. I didn't really know why before, but it seems that it might be related to that organization of his. Not only that, Yuichi started connecting the dots of all of the bounties that were being collected as of late. Many of the bandits with bounties died before the people he employed to deal with them even got close to finding their hideouts. Yuichi had received reports of masked men turning in those bounties, and now he realized that they were all affiliated with the organization that the Red Dot was building. It was quick and decisive, and it cleaned up a lot of the danger on the roads, which allowed merchants and villagers to feel a lot safer. A village of bounty hunters. Training other children to follow the same profession. I am unsure how to feel about this still. In the end, the daemon decided that he would just wait to meet with the Red Dot, as he had promised to visit rather quickly. It was a bit concerning considering the Red Dot's reputation, but the delegation did also vouch for his character, as he had been nothing but polite to them. Yuichi still summoned all his strongest guards at the castle, while expecting the bounty hunter. Mifune was also there to assist in case something happened and represent the Land of Iron's military power. All of the leaders of the noble families were informed of the situation, and they all sent their strongest warriors to the castle to defend their lord, just in case. Some of the leaders even showed up themselves, as they were renowned samurai in their own right. Everyone was gathered in the throne room, where a large table had been set up. Each noble was sat down, refreshments in front of them, and their personal guards behind them and lined up in the hall. The daemon stood at the head of the table, dressed in expensive white royal attire garb, his face obscured by a golden veil connected to his large hat. Everyone had already been present at the castle for a few days, and some of the people present were getting a bit bored with waiting. Sake could only entertain them for so long at the end of the day. My lord, when exactly do you think this Red Dot is going to appear? Mifune was the one to speak up first. His long grey hair and pointy beard flowed in the wind, as the windows inside the throne room were all open. He was wearing a black garb underneath his grey samurai armor, and at his waist was a regular katana. The samurai and nobles in the room all refrained from speaking about their displeasure. But Mifune didn't seem to have the same reservations. Today is the last day. He had promised to arrive shortly. If he does not arrive, then I will have to send people after him and his organization. Yuichi spoke from behind the golden veil, his voice resounding throughout the hall, which caused many of the nobles present to nod in acceptance. Having a decisive leader was a good thing in their opinion, and they, as a nation, didn't see the Red Dot as a large danger to them. Mifune's point of view was, however, different. I appreciate your resolve, my lord, but please understand that going after the Red Dot might not be as simple as that. It would be a commitment that will require many lives we cannot afford to spare. I urge you to reconsider. As the general, Mifune wanted to avoid losing the lives of too many of his men. And what do you propose? That our great country bends backwards to attend to the will of some vagrant? One of the nobles present spoke out in a haughty tone, spreading out her fan and asking a rhetorical question with a scowl on her face. She was dressed in a flower-themed red yukata, with her black hair flowing back all the way to her waist. Her face was fair, and her skin was as white as snow, mostly thanks to makeup. Her eyes were also dark to match her hair. It all gave her the appearance of a noble beauty. She was mainly there because she wanted to deepen her relations with the other nobles, and also hopefully get to meet the elusive Red Dot, as he seemed like a useful ally to have. However, Ken had yet to show up, and she decided to voice out her displeasure without much hesitation. She was Yuko Chinatsu, the head of the Chinatsu merchant clan, and one of the youngest leaders present, being only 26 years old. The elders in the room would have usually ignored her presence or tried to dispute her words. Being a woman in their field was rather difficult after all, but now they all seemed to unanimously agree with her. That vagrant can likely assassinate everyone in this room before the end of the week. We can't afford to underestimate him in any way. He's already proven himself in his skirmish with the Grass Village at the end of the Second Shinobi War. Mifune simply narrowed his eyes at the people in the room. His determined tone remained unflinching, even when all of the nobles eyed him with scrutiny. He truly felt disdain for the nobles present, as he and his men would be the ones to suffer from their choices if a war was to break out within their territory. Mifune also felt bad for the civilians, who were already suffering enough because of the Shinobi War. Their country relied on exports as well, so the constant fighting in nearby territories directly hampered the lives of the regular honest living folk. If the Red Dot truly decided to wage war against them, Mifune was confident he could win. He knew of the forces that he commanded, and he knew that there were few in the world that could match them. But he was also sure the damage done to their land would leave them open for the other nearby nations, which was a much larger disaster than just some bounty hunter starting an organization in their territory. He truly is not a figure I would wish to face off against under normal circumstances, especially since he specializes in assassinations from initial reports. Alas, we can't afford to not take action, lest we become the laughingstock of other nations for harboring a band of supposed war criminals right under our noses. Yoichi was the one to respond to Mifyun's concerns, though his response did little to help the general. Who cares about you losing face? The lives of my men and the future of our country are at stake here. Alas, Mifyun didn't continue speaking, knowing that lashing out like that at the daemon was not a good idea. To the side, Yuko also smiled a bit, covering it with her fan in the process. Just saying some stupid shit like this is enough to buy me some brownie points with these old fools. Alas, winning over the general might not be all that easy. Yuko couldn't care less about waiting for the red dot to show up. She simply wanted to build up relationships with as many of the noble families as possible. She could easily read the mood in the room and tell that everyone was displeased for having to wait around for a bounty hunter, so she voiced out their displeasure without any hesitation. To her, this was all a game she planned to win. She may not have been dealt the best hand, but that didn't mean she was unable to make the best of it. The dealings of a royal court are never going to get boring. The people at the table couldn't help but blink a few times as they wondered who the voice belonged to. At first, they thought it was one of the samurai to the side, but their samurai knew better than to interrupt the nobles. Then, they looked to the side. Sitting at the same table as them was an unfamiliar figure, eating grapes and drinking wine alongside them. Suddenly, all of the nobles jumped away from the table in shock, all of their spines shuddering, when catching a glimpse of the man they couldn't quite recognize. Guards, Yuko said as she gestured for the shocked samurai to draw their blades, as she herself unfolded a sharpened metallic fan. In an instant, all of the samurai present drew their swords and pointed them at that chair, where one short man stood, still drinking wine with a smile on his eyeless face. The man was only wearing a black coat, and his long spiky hair was just as long as Yuko's, who was still staring at his figure with an unnerved expression. Who are you? State your business right away. Mifyun had also drawn his sword already, walking over to the disfigured man with careful steps. He was less flustered than the others, but also shocked that he hadn't even realized when the man had entered the room. Oh, wait, I forgot that no one has seen me like this before. The disfigured man then took a mask, which had been hanging on his belt, and put it on his face. Instantly, everyone in the room was staring at a man wearing a white mask with a red dot in the middle, and they all instantly understood who they were staring at. Red Dot, it's a pleasure to finally see you in person. The daemon was the first one to recover, as the nobles were still processing what had just happened. The lord immediately glared at the samurai and clapped his hands, gesturing for them to sheath their blades. The pleasure is mine, Lord Daimon. One rarely receives such an invitation after all. Also, please call me Ken, feels a lot more natural to me. The blind bounty hunter spoke out with confidence, not even bothered by the fact that dozens of samurai were aiming to kill him seconds before. The daemon laughed heartily when hearing the blind man's request. Tilda very well. Ken it is then. You may also call me Yuchi. No reason to mince words at this stage. The daemon would have normally not accepted someone disrespecting him in any way, but Ken had technically just shown him that he could have killed them all at any second. So he decided to throw away honorifics for once, be it from shock or fear. Red Dot Mifyun also muttered as he sheathed his katana, his eyes narrowing, as he studied the infamous bounty hunter's figure. Mifyun could clearly see him sitting at the table, yet he couldn't feel him there at all. It was bizarre, to say the least. How did you manage to sneak in here undetected? Mifyun immediately questioned him, the security of the castle being his #1 concern at that stage. The windows are open, most shinobi are also able to just crawl on the ceiling. These chairs are pretty tall. So from there, it was just a matter of dropping down when everyone's gaze was not focused on the table. Ken pointed at the large windows off to the side. He didn't see any issue in explaining how he had gotten in. It wasn't like he was there for an assassination, though his entrance definitely served as a demonstration of what he was capable of. I see. Interesting method indeed, a master in stealth, to say the least. How did the men on the other side of the table not notice you? Mifyun was appreciative that the Red Dot answered honestly, but that didn't mean he was satisfied with the answer completely. Such a mishap was not something that could be overlooked. Now, we didn't invite him here for an interrogation. I'm assuming the samurai present were just not staring at the table. In fear of provoking any of the nobles present, Yuko was the one to calm him down in the end, folding her fan, and being the first noble to sit back down at the table. Seeing her do so made the other men also sit down, and Ken sighed as he finally sat up and walked a bit closer to Yuchi, Mifune made sure to stand in between them though, just for protection. In the end, Ken sat back down a bit closer to the Lord, right in between Mifune and Yuko. The noblewoman's gaze was curious, sometimes shifting towards the bounty hunter that stood beside her. He would make a useful ally indeed. Yuko's thoughts immediately started running wild as she imagined employing an assassin like him under her. Yuchi looked at the bounty hunter with a bit of sweat on his brow, before taking a deep breath and calming himself down completely. In the end, he smiled underneath his golden veil before he started speaking again. Now, I think it's time for us to get down to business. POV narration. To say that Ken's entrance left an impression on the people present would have been a severe understatement. None of them had managed to sense him until he made himself known. The nobles especially hadn't even looked at his side of the table, and the samurai lined up near the table had also done precisely as Yuko had said, averting their gazes from the table where the most influential nobles ate. It was a great mishap on their part, but it wasn't completely their fault either. At the end of the day, not even Mifune, their strongest samurai in general, managed to sense Ken. At least that occurrence gave them a bit of perspective on how grim the state of affairs would be if they were to actually start going after Ken. Mifune's prediction about the red dot being able to assassinate all of them by the end of the week seemed a lot more plausible now. It didn't help that they didn't have any seals or formations in place to detect intruders. Mifune was at least now aware of a major flaw in their defense. After all, if Ken was able to sneak in, then others would be able to do so as well. The last thing the Land of Iron needed was for their leader to be assassinated. Ken now sat at their table masked, but all of the nobles present still remembered how his face looked. Or rather, lack of face. Mifune and the rest didn't really take it seriously though. They just took it as genjutsu or transformation. After all, Ken was well known for only his mask. They doubted he would reveal his real face to them. Yuko also became very curious, especially when seeing the abnormal appearance he had chosen to transform into. She now wanted to see his real face even more. I'm sure I'll have the opportunity if I do end up allying myself with him or his organization. Yuko smiled mischievously underneath her spread out fan. With precise and careful movements, she inched a bit closer to the bounty hunter at her side. No one besides Mifune noticed her actions. The general simply scoffed at the fox-like noble lady. Scheming types are always the most annoying to have in a court. Ken proceeded to ignore her presence completely. Now, Lord Yuchi, I'm glad you wish to get straight to the point. The bounty hunter nodded and crossed his legs, interlocking his fingers above the table as he turned his head towards the daemon. Of course. I'm sure you are a busy man after all. Yuchi smiled underneath his golden veil, now finally calm. He was still planning on punishing all of the samurai in the room for letting a renowned assassin just sit at the same table as them unnoticed, but that would come later. I heard plenty of reports from my delegation, as I'm sure you were expecting. Yuchi brought up a small scroll, opened it up and started looking through it right in front of Ken. Of course, I assumed the daemon would be interested in what happens in his own territory. The assassin simply nodded, his stature remaining the same. Indeed, especially a land such as ours. I was not expecting to find out that you are building an entire organization right at the borders. Yuchi didn't bother mincing any words. He also wasn't putting on any airs of superiority while sitting at the same table as Ken. He was simply lining the facts, listing everything that he had found and that had been reported to him. Alas, I was never trying to hide it anyway. Rumors spread quickly even when silence is bought. Indeed, silence can only be bought from trustworthy people anyway. The construction workers you had hired went all quiet about what they had helped build. Figures. Alas, I want my associates to have the best possible arrangements and living conditions. Ken smiled a bit under his mask as he spoke of that. It wasn't even a lie. He knew that the morale and determination of his recruits were directly tied to their living conditions and food. The construction workers he had hired were only paid a bit for their silence. Their real purpose was to spread word of the Dark Brotherhood, while making it look like he wasn't actually trying to catch anyone's attention. And they had accomplished their mission perfectly, exactly as Ken had wanted them to. Mifune looked to the side with a raised eyebrow, studying the assassin with a careful gaze. Most of your associates are still children in training. The general scowled as he spoke, addressing the issue of Ken training up child soldiers instantly. Indeed, all of the children were given a choice when recruited, to either remain with their old orphanages and live their lives normally, hoping that no other wars break out and they survive, or join our brotherhood and train as assassins. Ken recounted their recruiting process without withholding anything. He had given Tosho specific requirements for the recruitment, and it was likely the most humane/morally sound way to go about things. Ken was against involving civilians in conflicts, but he wasn't planning on stopping them from joining if they wanted to, which was why he decided on using that choice as a recruitment strategy. ESK. And was supposed to just believe you. Mifune was a bit skeptical, the same as the vast majority of nobles present. Yuko didn't seem to particularly care about the recruitment process, but she still decided to speak out. Now, I understand skepticism, I myself wouldn't be inclined to believe everything that a guest says at face value. However, if I remember correctly, the delegation was able to attest to the treatment of the orphans. Her melodious voice was calm. She spoke in a clear tone, defining her position, and using the evidence they had to further her points, at the same time gaining a few points with the red dot. At least in her mind, Ken didn't see her any differently because she spoke out in his favor. He was still just as indifferent to her. She appeared impartial in her words, but it was clear to anyone with the brain that she was planning something. Even if your recruitment methods are humane, the fact that you are going to use child soldiers is still not in line with the customs of our land. Mifune was still unconvinced and was quite willing to bring up any subject, even if he wanted to avoid a war. That didn't mean he was okay with what Ken was attempting to do in their territory. He just hoped they'd be able to convince the bounty hunter to move base elsewhere. Do not worry, I am also vehemently against using children assassins. I don't plan on sending any of them on the field before I feel they are truly prepared, and one of the factors necessary would be for them to mature properly. Ken didn't mind having to explain parts of his plans to the people present. His organization already had people working as assassins and bringing in revenue in the form of Suburo's clones. Their organization was still sitting on a lot of wealth stolen from the grass village, but that was not going to last them for the entirety of the recruits' childhoods. The clones were genuinely the only reason they were able to recruit so many people at once. So Ken considered Saburo a very important ally, so he needed to treat him with care. I understand. If that is truly the case, then ethically speaking your organization is indeed not unaligned with our policies. The daemon nodded as he spoke, rather pleased with what he was hearing. However, these claims do still need to be verified. Yuichi looked toward Mifune as he spoke. The general seemed to get the message. I would like to propose for one of my men to stay within the compound and report the status of the recruits to us on a regular basis. Mifune looked at Ken with a serious gaze, his eyes narrowed. Unacceptable. The Dark Brotherhood is a personal business. It has nothing to do with the Land of Iron itself. Ken didn't even take a second to think about it. He turned his head towards the general with a scowl underneath his mask. This Dark Brotherhood of yours is still within our territory. You can either move camp or accept our demands. Mifune was quick to hint at the possibility of Ken moving his base, but the swordsman was having none of it. Yuichi gave his general a strange look. A rather risky strategy to employ, but I can salvage this. Ken was about to tell Mifune off, but the daemon interrupted their argument. Now, I believe we can come to a middle ground when it comes to this. The Dark Brotherhood will remain a private business, of course. However, I propose that we should be allowed to send a person to check it out at least once a month. Yuichi gestured for his general to calm down as he spoke, and he addressed Ken with a respectful tone. I can agree to that. We may discuss more details when the time for that comes. The masked swordsman nodded, and Mifune also seemed to agree with the compromise, though he still seemed a bit uneasy. I'm glad we can come to an agreement with that. However, there is also the issue of taxation. All revenue made within the territory is taxed by the ruling part of the said territory. Of course, the most important part. The daemon would obviously also reach the subject of money and taxation. That is the case under normal circumstances, yes. However, our main and currently the only form of income is bounties. Those are not usually taxed under any jurisdiction. Ken had already made sure to study the law of the Land of Iron, and Saburo did help him a lot with his knowledge. Although the strawman was more inclined towards knowledge of human experimentation, he was still able to help Ken learn about the laws. Most of Ken's time after the delegation had visited them was actually spent listening to either Tosho or Saburo read books about the laws and customs of the Land of Iron and the lands surrounding it. Indeed, taxation for bounties isn't an issue. It would actually be unethical for us to tax bounties. However, your organization itself stands on a land, so tax for the land does need to be paid. Bear in mind that this will be the case in any land you got to, unless you are to become affiliated with the government in question. Yuichi was surprisingly lenient. At least all of the nobles present were thinking that he was lenient, but no one raised their voice or complained. They didn't exactly want to enter the sights of the assassin that had just snuck up on them, so at the very least Ken's entrance did its part in helping him gain an edge in the negotiation. I was expecting this type of tax to come into question. I don't think I have a way of outright avoiding it. But the Dark Brotherhood can't currently afford to pay taxes on land, lest we go broke much faster than expected. I understand that some type of remuneration must be given for the land we are occupying, although I'm not pleased with it. We have occupied an unused mountain range, and started developing with money out of our own pockets. Yuichi nodded a bit when hearing Ken's words, and he instantly started thinking up a way to come to a compromise regarding that tax. They couldn't just avoid taxing the Dark Brotherhood, as it would make it look as if the Land of Iron was afraid of Ken. Well, maybe you should have reached out to ask for authorization before you started doing things on your own. Mifune was also of a similar mind, but he was still doing his best to antagonize Ken, and hopefully convince him to leave the Land of Iron altogether. Someone like him is bound to bring along a lot of trouble. I don't want his presence to burden my people. This time, Ken seemed to ignore Mifyun's jab, only scratching his chin a bit as he started speaking again. Well, I understand your stance on this. I believe we can come to an agreement regarding taxation as well. For instance, my Dark Brotherhood can make sure that the streets are clean wherever we can. That in itself should boost your income as more and more merchants will start frequenting the safer areas. The Daimyo nodded when hearing Ken's explanation, but it seemed that he wasn't fully satisfied with it. That is true. However, that is merely an after effect of your main business, which is collecting bounties. Yuchi didn't hold back at all, immediately pointing out the thing that was displeasing him. Of course, that can also be argued. However, you cannot deny that such a thing wouldn't happen without the presence of my organization. A lot of the members of bandit groups don't even have bounties, and we are taking care of them as well. Outlaws like that are bound to become less and less eager to set up their business in the Land of Iron due to us spreading influence. Overall, I think you have a lot more to gain from keeping us around than driving us away. The nobles in the room seemed to nod when hearing Ken's explanation. They all seemed rather pleased with it. Even Mifyun seemed to be contemplating it seriously. Yuko at Ken's side once again hid her smile behind her fan. His answers are too careful. He definitely prepared everything beforehand. Either that or he is a really good speaker. Not only that, but instead of following up on his arrival and threatening us with our lives, he is genuinely debating the Daimyo, proving he wishes for a partnership, and that he isn't hostile in any way. Either way, a business venture with him is starting to look more and more like a necessity for my clan to become more prosperous. The noblewoman's eyes narrowed as she started seeing Ken as a capable man, one worth keeping around at the very least. You do make a great point. It does seem that the benefits of keeping you around are far greater. Yuchi smiled underneath his golden veil. His thoughts were somewhat similar to Yuko's, but he was looking at ways from a very different perspective. This man, he is indeed formidable. I need to do my best to gain at least partial ownership of that organization here. I think I have a plan for that already, but it will have to wait. Good points indeed. Now it was time for Mifyun to speak out again, but there is still the risk factor involved. At that point, all of the nobles looked at Mifyun, glad that someone was addressing that as well. It is no denying that you are a controversial figure. Red Dot, the shinobi you keep with you are also unknown, though we were unable to find anything on them, so it should be fine in that regard. Controversial indeed. However, none of the nations would ever be waging a war with a mere organization. Ken nodded at the general's concerns, understanding his concerns perfectly and doing his best to dispel them. I don't want a nation dragged into the struggles of the shinobi. This is my main concern. Please don't drag my people into a bloody war. The general's voice sounded tired by the end, and this time Ken turned his head towards him again. I understand. I assure you that I don't want your people or my organization to ever get involved in the wars that shinobi are constantly fighting in the first place. Sending children that were mostly orphaned by war into a war would be exceedingly cruel. After that, the throne room was silent for a few seconds as the nobles took a few seconds to process the words of the assassin leader. The masked swordsman pursed his lips as he stretched his legs a bit underneath the table. Well, I for one am glad that we managed to reach an understanding. Ken nodded and slowly stood up, surprising the nobles present. You are departing already. A feast would be in order, since this is the start of a rather fruitful partnership. The Daimyo asked as he immediately waved to his servants and signaled them to bring more food to the table. Lord Yuchi, I appreciate the offer. However, I am needed elsewhere. It has been a pleasure. We shall meet again, of course. Ken then bowed slightly as the Daimyo and the nobles were present, his black hair swaying slightly, as he then started walking towards an open window. Some of the samurai eyed him carefully as he passed them by. Some even reached for their blades, almost instinctually. Ken didn't react to that in any meaningful way. After all, it was rather normal for trained warriors to react in that way when a beast stared them down. No one stopped him as he leaped out the window either. And just like that, the meeting was over. POV narration. As soon as Ken left the room, Yuchi sighed and looked at everyone else at the table. So that was the Red Dot. Huh, one of the elders said as he tapped the table with his finger. Or Ken, which might be either his real name or an alias, Yuko said as she smiled a bit. It might just be his real name, not that it tells us anything. It's highly unlikely that someone like him is recorded anywhere, Yuchi said as he crossed his fingers and looked at everyone at the table through that golden veil of his. Indeed, from his demeanor, we can at least assume that he wishes to have a fruitful relationship with our Land of Iron. Mifyun sighed as he rubbed his long beard. Still, having an organization that big acting independently from us in our own territory, it's certainly not a good look. One of the nobles said as he finally regained his bearings. It really can't be helped. The Red Dot has already proven that he's able to waltz in here at any time at this point. We're lucky he didn't make any outrageous demands. Yuichi could only sigh once again when thinking about it. The daemon was a smart man. He understood that they had little to no leverage over Ken, especially since he had decided to show himself in such a way. It was obvious that the daemon would now be forced to tighten the security around his castle. Maybe even look into hiring a few shinobi guards to keep by his side. Mifune was also already thinking about hiring the Uzumaki clan to create a few seals around the castle. It was certainly going to be needed at the end of the day. He won't be able to waltz in here like that again. We'll make sure of it, Mifune said as he pondered on his idea more and more. The Land of Iron was certainly a rich country, so they could afford to hire the shinobi. The only issue was whether or not the shinobi were willing to help them in such a way. There was also the issue with the fact that the Uzumaki clan was being targeted by everyone currently, and it was only a matter of time before the forces that feared them banded together to destroy it. Mifune was only aware of it because he had connections with the shinobi world, but there was really nothing that he could do about it. He'll find a way. Even if we do detect him, are you confident in stopping him, General Mifune? Yuichi had clearly lost all trust in the capabilities of his guards to defend him, and Mifune couldn't really blame him. Well, if more of my men were here, then we would certainly be able to stop him, or at least root him. Mifune was still rather confident in his answer, though he had stumbled a bit at the start when finding his words. It is not normal for a daemon to have an army raised in his palace at all times. Yuichi simply shook his head. He understood that just a group of samurai wouldn't be enough to stop the red dot from taking his head. Well, we don't need to have the army in the castle at all times, but it will be a necessity if we do decide to antagonize him eventually. Mifune was well aware of the logistics of housing an army inside their castles. The resources needed would also cause a bit of a drain on the capital, so it would likely remain as a last resort, when or if they decided to wage war against the Dark Brotherhood. You're really thinking about antagonizing him after this stunt? Yuko asked as she once again unfolded her fan and started slowly fanning her face. We need to prepare for every possible outcome. Mifune nodded as he crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes at the fox-like woman in front of him. There might be no need to antagonize them though, the daemon spoke, reaching underneath the golden veil with one of his hands, and scratching his chin. Mifune looked at the daemon with quite a bit of confusion. Oh, you have something planned already? Yuko smiled as she spoke, immediately perking up. Indeed, you see, the Red Dot's organization only has one source of income currently, and that completely relies on our bounties, correct? Yuichi couldn't help but feel a smile creeping on his lips as he spoke as well. Wait, you don't mean? Mifune immediately became uneasy. No, we are not going to obstruct his business. However, he will eventually run out of bandits to hunt in his proximity, which will eventually lead to him running out of money. The daemon's smile became more and more pronounced as he spoke. So you're playing a game of attrition then? Yuko narrowed her eyes as she continued smiling under her fan. Indeed. When he eventually runs out of money or is close to doing so, I will be there to provide his organization financial support in exchange for a small part of the organization, of course. Yuichi felt a bit scummy saying it out loud, but it was really the only feasible way he could think of when it came to gaining control of Ken's business. Yuko simply nodded. That might just work, dear lord, but you're just assuming that the Red Dot's organization won't expand at all in the meantime. That is a large mistake on your part. The noblewoman was not about to let such a thing happen. She already deemed Ken to be a highly capable diplomat and assassin. His sense of business was not something she was privy to, but she already decided to look for ways to ally herself with him. That alliance was bound to bring more funds to the Dark Brotherhood, and Yuko was well aware of that, but she didn't tell Yuichi or anyone else at the table. It's an interesting idea, but we might also have to put fewer bounties on bandits. We just need to not make it noticeable. One of the nobles at the table felt the need to add that, and most of the other nobles seemed to agree. I don't think that's a good idea. We're already playing with fire. Trying to stick a hand in it doesn't seem like a good idea. Mifune was firmly against it. He didn't care if Yuichi attempted his scheme to buy out the Dark Brotherhood, as it wasn't something that directly harmed them and could antagonize the Red Dot. But actually hampering their one source of income would 100% cause the Dark Brotherhood to come for their heads. Mifune wasn't scared, sure, but he hated even thinking about the chaos that would ensue afterwards. Many civilians would have to suffer if all of the nobles were to die. They were, after all, the one thing that upheld the law in their own cities and neighboring villages. If they were killed systematically and quickly enough, then crime was bound to run amok in every village. Well, we are already taking a risk with this entire situation. I say we wait for now. Wait for them to naturally run out of resources, and then our delegation can offer a help. Yuichi also seemed to be against the idea of lowering Ken's revenue manually, as he also wanted to avoid a conflict. The nobles seemed to be discouraged, but they couldn't argue with the daemon. so they just stopped speaking. One person was not scared to argue with the daemon though. The plan is indeed good. Lord Daemon Yuuko's melodious voice rang throughout the throne room, causing everyone to look at her with confusion. However, what are we going to do if the Dark Brotherhood aims for bounties of other countries as well? Yuuko was the head of a merchant clan. She decided to at least let her experience be known when it came to her area of expertise, which was making money. That is indeed a possibility. However, bandits in general will stop posting up anywhere near their organization, and news will spread about the Dark Brotherhood soon. Yuichi didn't mind having his ideas challenged or questioned. He responded in kind with a patience befitting of a lord. The more bandits avoid their area, the more the Dark Brotherhood will have to spread out their forces, and the slower their income will come in, which will eventually lead to the same results. Yuichi had already thought about that aspect as well. Rather, he expected it to happen. He expected the Dark Brotherhood to hunt bounties around the elemental nations after all, just like the Red Dot himself had hunted down bounties wherever he could, chasing rumors and listening in on whispers. Yuichi was still confident that the Dark Brotherhood would eventually still reach the point where they would no longer be self-sufficient. To him it was just a matter of when. Understood, my lord. It seems you have thought of everything already. Yuuko smiled and bowed slightly towards the daemon. A few nobles could be heard muttering about the noblewoman, saying that she once again spoke out of line. Alas, being a young woman among a group of old men was rather difficult. Yuuko somewhat struggled to have everyone treat her like an equal. I thank you all for gathering here. I shall start making arrangements for the inspectors that will visit the Dark Brotherhood monthly from this day onward. The rest of you can continue business as usual. I shall summon you all if something requires your attention. The daemon waved his hand, and all of the nobles and samurai present bowed and left. Mifune remained, as the two of them would still need to discuss the security of the castle. And while all that was happening, the person that was the cause for all of that stir was simply strolling around the city without any stress. Ken lazily walked around in the capital of the Land of Iron, having just left the meeting. It had gone much better than he had expected, but he had also prepared for it. It was clear that his entrance had a lot more impact on the nobles present than he had expected. Ken was a bit reluctant to do it at first, but at the end of the day, it was a subtle threat of sorts, a form of manipulation that he needed to use in order to tilt the scales in his favor. Petty tricks like those were his bread and butter at the end of the day, though he had never been too used to diplomacy, especially the state of affairs in what he considered a medieval/backward society. Even then, the Land of Iron was a lot more modern than the surrounding lands, as they absolutely abhorred using child labor or child soldiers. Their techniques and powers were also impressive. From what Ken had felt in that throne room, just a few dozen samurai lining the hall would have been enough to burn the grass village to the ground. Ken only gathered that from the way they had carried themselves. When he had made his presence known, most of them had already placed their hands on their blades. There was no hesitation and no wasted movement. All of them were prepared to fight Ken to the death at the flip of a coin. It was rather commendable. Mifune himself was also powerful. The general of the Land of Iron had an aura of his own, but Ken was still confident if he were to face them. I might need to train a bit more. Everyone in that room could have likely injured me. Even in my scaled sage mode, trained samurai were always able to coat their blades in chakra, and their cutting power usually differed on ranking, but every samurai there gave Ken the feeling that they would be annoying to fight. Normal ninjutsu and genjutsu are quite ineffective against me. Fighting an army of samurai might actually be more difficult than 3 grass villages. At the same time, that small meeting helped give Ken some perspective. So now he simply strolled the streets, listening in on some interesting news, and just casually studying the defenses of the capital. The capital itself was a rather large town, with the castle being built in the center of it. It was built in a rather scenic spot, being right in the mouth of one of the Wolf Mountains, the 3 large mountains that formed the 3 Wolves. The city itself was covered by snow, thanks to the strange shape of the mountain, which almost acted like a roof against the rain and snow above. The mountain itself was massive and stable, so there was no danger of it falling either. Everyone walked on the streets with smiles on their faces. No one even recognized the Red Dot, as he was really only well known in the shinobi world. This is rather peaceful. Ken took a deep breath, moving his mask slightly to the side to uncover his mouth. As he exhaled a small cloud of fog and smiled a bit. The sound of children playing in the distance. The sound of merchants doing business. The sound of drunkards singing. It was also pleasing to the ear, but there was one sound that didn't sound like the others. The sound of blades clashing. Ken immediately turned his head in that direction, tilting his head slightly before instantly disappearing from his location, shocking a few of the people nearby that had been looking towards him. Might as well check it out. POV narration now. Ken wouldn't have been shocked if he had heard blades clashing in the Land of Iron of all places, but the fact that it was coming from a random alleyway instead of a training ground was a bit interesting. There was also the fact that the smell of blood permeated the area, though it was faint. Who would be so bold as to start killing in the middle of the capital? Ken honestly had no clue, but he was about to find out. When reaching that alleyway, he was faced with a rather intriguing scene. 3 people dressed as ninjas and 2 dressed as samurai, cornering a single samurai who was doing his best to protect what Ken assumed was a young noblewoman. She seemed to be dressed in rather expensive clothes, but Ken couldn't really tell much else about her features. She was wearing a rather strange veil, which covered most of her face. Near them were the corpses of 2 other samurai, looking like they had been backstabbed. The usual tomfoolery between murderers, infiltration and backstabbing, true classics in our line of work. Ken could somewhat appreciate decent work when it was in front of him, but they had made a major mistake. The samurai they're cornering, he looks a lot stronger than them, but he's likely stuck protecting that girl, so he is unable to go all out. The 5 assassins should have aimed to finish this as soon as possible. Alas, it already attracted unwanted attention after all. The assassins and the stronger samurai, who Ken assumed was a Hatamoto, seemed to be stuck in a stalemate for a few seconds. The assassins knew that getting close to the Hatamoto would definitely lead to one of them being killed. Ken had ample time to intervene. The true question was if it was even worth his time. Nobles being assassinated is not exactly uncommon, though I don't see how a young girl like her deserves such treatment. The blind swordsman stood there for a second, crouched down on a rooftop and studying the situation a bit more. Surprisingly, the assassins then started speaking. "ESK Hatamoto, stop resisting already. You know it's futile. The 5 of us can easily kill you. Hand Lady Harada over, and we may even share the ransom with you." Ken raised an eyebrow when hearing that. So, not assassins, kidnappers still. They made a rather elaborate plan to catch whoever this Lady Harada is. The Hatamoto simply stared at the 5 men with hate in his eyes. The young girl behind him trembled a bit in fear. "Heh, we'll even let you play with her as well." One of the other kidnappers also tried to entice the Hatamoto, but he only received an angry shout. "You dirty animals. She is but a teenager." The Hatamoto scowled deeply, grasping his blade tighter in his hands. Okay, they may have planned this out well, but not all of them are smart. Ken shook his head a bit when hearing the exchange. "I guess I could kill them. It would be as easy as breathing. But I could also track them down for a while, wait for the lady's father to pay the bounty, and steal the money from them afterwards." Ken was seriously contemplating that before a realization hit him. Wait a moment, wasn't the Daimyo's family name Harada? Ken smiled deviously under his mask. Yes, it is. I guess getting involved in this suddenly became worthwhile." The blind swordsman stepped along the rooftops without making any sound. He smiled as he walked with carefree steps. It was extremely worthwhile to get the daemon to owe him a favor. A favor like that was worth a lot more than any amount of money. Ken didn't interfere immediately though. A good farmer always knew to wait for the fruit to be ripe enough for picking. Instead, Ken watched the righteous Hatamoto fight with honor. The 5 kidnappers quickly closed in on the Hatamoto when noticing they couldn't bribe him. The second they stepped forwards, the Hatamoto's blade was already gunning for one of the men's necks. Even injured, he was more than capable of defending himself. The Hatamoto decapitated one of the kidnappers instantly, while the rest of them all dodged his slash with room to spare. One of the kidnappers threw a kunai at the noble lady, forcing the Hatamoto to block it with his blade, while another approached him and stabbed at his gut. Shit. The Hatamoto scowled when seeing their dirty moves, but he still managed to kick the blade away, causing it to only graze his side instead of gut him alive. Unfortunately, he left himself open as one of the other kidnappers stepped to the side and kicked his other leg, breaking his balance and causing him to fall to the ground. Shit. The Hatamoto knew very well that the situation was not good for him at all. Die. The kidnapper quickly stabbed down at the fallen samurai. The Hatamoto managed to roll away in time, slashing one of the kidnappers in 2. Before his blade was blocked by another one of the kidnappers. Both swordsmen were covering their weapons in shock chakra, but the tired Hatamoto was, unfortunately, the one to give way first as his blade broke and the stronger kidnappers slashed him across the chest. "I am sorry, my lord," that was all the Hatamoto could think as he fell to the ground. "ESK, troublesome samurai. Had to kill 2 of my grunts before croaking her," the strong kidnapper slash ringleader said as he then pointed his blade at the fallen samurai, prepared to finish him off. He looked at the noble lady with a sadistic grin as his sword glinted. His eyes shined with pleasure when seeing her fear. Lady Harada seemed to turn completely white when seeing her guard on the ground. She knew what fate awaited her. She simply closed her eyes, not wanting to see the man that had fought to protect her die in such a cruel way. One thing was for sure, she regretted not convincing Mifune to teach her how to wield a sword. Just as her hopes were dying down, a voice she didn't recognize spoke out this strange thing. It seemed to be very close to her. Now, this is a rather strange scene to come across in such a beautiful city. The ringleader immediately stopped his actions. When hearing that voice, his blade also froze in place. But not because he wanted it. No. The ringleader looked down to see a short masked man with spiky long hair crouching down beside the Hatamoto. It was none other than Ken, and he was just holding the kidnapper's katana in place with his bare hand, gripping it by its dull part without shaking even slightly, regardless of how much strength the kidnapper tried to apply. Children shouldn't play with weapons. The masked man stood as still as a statue, seemingly glaring at the strong kidnapper through his mask. The blind swordsman then gripped the blade tightly, causing cracks to appear everywhere on the blade. Before it crumbled completely, Ken infused it with his own chakra, causing lighting to cover the entire blade including the hilt, which ended up shocking the kidnapper and forcing him to let go of it and jump back towards his comrades. What the hell do you want? Is he some sort of hidden guard or something? Would the daemon of the Land of Iron really hire people this sneaky? The kidnapper was confused, but he didn't panic yet. Well, I was bored a bit earlier. Seeing how your blood spills might make my day a bit brighter, Ken nodded before standing up. He smiled a bit underneath his mask as he turned his head toward what he presumed was the daemon's daughter behind him. She still seemed petrified in fear, but that was likely because she didn't know him either. At first, the blind swordsman wanted to wait for the Hatamoto to die, then swoop in when things looked the worst. But seeing the man fight with his life on the line like that did manage to make Ken respect him. Besides, it also felt like an appropriate enough moment to intervene. The fruit was ripe enough. Now, there's no need to go that far. I bet you're just some random mercenary, right? We can all split the ransom. 2 of my men died here already, so you can get a decent share. The kidnapper was quick to try and entice Ken. After all, he was quite sure Ken wasn't associated with the daemon, so he wanted to at least test his luck. Only 2 of your men died today. Ken simply tilted his head, not answering the question, instead asking a question of his own. Are you sure about that? The masked swordman's voice sent a shiver down the kidnapper's spine. He immediately turned around to look at his underlings. The 2 of them were standing still, with their arms raised. It was as if they were petrified, with their heads twisted so much that they were almost broken off. Someone had twisted their necks with such ferocity that it went beyond a 360-degree angle. It was almost as if someone had tried to unscrew their heads from their bodies. The ringleader's back was filled with cold sweat when he noticed that their bodies were being held up by metal wire strung up for display. The kidnapper was instantly filled with dread, and the noble girl's attention was also finally brought to the other kidnappers, and she also almost covered her mouth and almost vomited in disgust. People these days really need to learn to pay more attention to their surroundings. Ken simply shook his head, acting disappointed while crossing his arms. I'll give you whatever you want. Please spare me. The kidnapper was instantly on his knees, knowing that there was no way he was killing or escaping from the man in front of him. Ooh, spare. Ken immediately turned into a blur and appeared right behind the kneeling kidnapper. The kidnapper was knocked out cold before he even had the means to react, receiving an axe kick to the head, the street underneath him cracking heavily. Don't worry, you won't die. I'm sure the daemon will appreciate having someone to torture and interrogate for this matter. Ken wasn't even thinking of killing the man in the first place. If he had wanted him dead, then he would have been dead before any words were exchanged, much like his comrades behind him. Who are you? Are you hired by my father? The noble girl finally mustered the courage to stand up, looking at Ken with wary eyes. Lady Harada, right? Hair. I am not under your father's employ, but I am an associate of his. Ken walked towards her slowly, approaching her carefully, in order to not scare her in any way. It seemed to work as the noble girl composed herself and calmed down a lot more, now that she knew the man in front of her was related to her father. I see. Thank you for your help, sir. Ken. You can call me Ken the blind swordsman, then turned his head up and threw a small piece of paper in the air. The paper proceeded to explode. It was a small explosion, but it was enough to echo throughout the entire city. You can call me you. Thank you for alerting the guards. You was a bit spooked by the sudden explosion, but she thankfully figured out what it was for rather quickly. No problem. I could walk you over to the castle myself, but I just left from there, and I don't want to make things awkward. Ken nodded at the young girl in front of him. Yu's smile trembled a bit when she heard that. You're worried about awkwardness in this situation? Well, from how the other kidnappers look, I guess this isn't all that special for him. Yu sighed a bit internally as she remembered the sight of the 2 kidnappers standing with their heads twisted. It was still a chilling scene for her, one that was sure to follow her into her nightmares. Although, the fact that the person that was capable of doing such a thing saved her was certainly going to help her sleep at night. I'll gladly invite you back to the castle. I'm sure my father would love to reward you handsomely for your service. Yu bowed slightly in gratitude when speaking. I appreciate the thought, young lady, but I'll be fine. Just tell your father that he owes me a solid. Ken just waved his hand dismissively, smiling a bit under his mask as he started walking away. But Dash, you might want to reward the samurai that protected you before I came here. Were it not for him, you would have been long gone before I even arrived at the scene. Ken was apparently not bothered by interrupting what was essentially the princess of the Land of Iron. Yu was a bit taken aback by that. She was used to people treating her with respect, but seeing the masked assassin's back getting further and further away gave her a strange feeling. I guess some people can go about in the world without any fear. Yu's eyes shined, and now she looked at the strung up corpses of her to-be kidnappers in a different light. It now looked more like a morbid work of art rather than the barbaric scene she had seen beforehand. I want to be like that someday. The young girl clenched her fists and smiled underneath her veil, looking once again in the direction that Ken had left in, wanting to go after him, only to notice that he was already nowhere to be seen. I'm sure I'll meet him again. I want him to teach me as well. I need to become stronger. EOV narration. It didn't take long for Yuchi to get word of what had happened. Mifune could feel the rage radiating off of him. It was clear that someone was going to get executed. Yu was after all only a 12-year-old girl. She had not even gotten any training when it came to fighting, as Yuchi had wanted her to stay away from that world as much as possible. It seemed that had been a mistake on his part though. In truth, there wouldn't have been much for a 12-year-old girl to do against 5 grown men, but at the very least she could have tried to escape on her own and call the guards. Mifune was quite mad that the kidnappers had also somehow infiltrated their forces. Such a thing was unacceptable. He immediately launched an internal investigation, and all of the corpses were recovered and were to be identified. The guards were perturbed when coming across the bodies, more specifically the 2 that had been strung up for display in the alleyway. Yuchi was immediately worried about his daughter's mental state when hearing about the state of the bodies. It was certainly the work of a bloodthirsty maniac, but it seemed that the bloodthirsty maniac was the one to save his daughter's life. Yuchi wanted to seek out the man and recruit him at first, but then his daughter told him his name, as well as the fact that they were apparently associates. The Red Dot. It wasn't surprising that Ken would be capable of such brutality. He had already gone on record ruthlessly hunting down bandits and even attacking a hidden village. The more important thing was the fact that now Yuchi owed him a favor. I think my plans to acquire the Dark Brotherhood will have to be postponed for now. He was still going to take the opportunity if it arose, but now Yuchi needed to look into different ways to integrate the organization into their systems. Mifune was off to inspect the bodies, and to personally question the one survivor whose head had been embedded into the ground. While all of that was happening, Yu was having a rather tiring time, as she was now stuck in her room for a while. She had done her best to tell everyone what had happened, and went into detail to describe how the samurai that had protected her fought valiantly, deserving of his title. Yuchi was dissatisfied that the man had failed, but the odds were stacked against him, so he decided to reward him for his efforts anyway, as his daughter was safe thanks to him. However, she also described Ken in a concerningly positive light. She seemed excited to explain how he had easily dispatched the 3 remaining kidnappers before she could even react. Yuchi was a bit concerned by her enthusiasm. Yu herself, for some reason, was a lot less bothered by the mutilated corpses than the patrolling guards that had found the scene. She was actually found staring at them from reports, though they did claim that she seemed petrified. Out of boredom, she started playing with some kitchen knives, throwing them at the wall with a smile on her face. In her mind, she imagined metallic wires connected to all knives as she continued playing around. The little princess had found a new passion. It was debatable whether it was cute or morbid though. She had somewhat steeled herself. I'll ask Dad to let Ken teach me. He said they were associates, and Dad did seem to know him. Needless to say, Yuchi was going to have quite the headache to handle in the future. Ken wasn't thinking about any of that though. He didn't bother to consider how his actions would affect the young impressionable mind of the princess, nor did he care. He instead started making his way home after dodging the patrolling guards. He left the city easily despite the lockdown, blending into the surroundings, and even transforming himself into a spider and crawling on the city walls and above them. The transformation jutsu became a whole lot more useful to him after Toshu taught him a few tricks, like the fact that he could transform into inanimate objects and animals. That part was something that hadn't been covered in the small booklet that one of his dads had gotten for him. Ken hadn't gotten around to using it often. It did have one rather obvious downside. To use the transformation, he'd have to continuously channel his chakra, which would make him easy easier to detect a sensory-type shinobi. Fortunately, it seemed that the Land of Iron didn't have many sensors at the part of the wall that Ken picked. Not that it would have mattered. It wasn't like Ken was at war with the Land of Iron. He was just testing their defenses and preparing for the future. I can expect them to be a lot more on guard. If they do start fighting me in the future, especially Yuchi, he'll likely start using body doubles as long as I'm around. It wasn't uncommon for lords to use body doubles. Ken was aware of it as well. In his mind, he already had made a plan to kill everyone he had met in that room. Whether or not he would need to make use of his plans, well, that was entirely up to them. To him, it was just something he was used to. Have a plan to kill everyone you meet? Although it sounded a bit silly, it was a core rule for an assassin. Be it ally or foe, you must be prepared to kill them under any circumstance. That was also how Ken had managed to kill all of the allies that had betrayed him before being caught by the police, because he was alert at all times, prepared to kill them at any moment. He always made sure to study the weaknesses of each and every person that he worked with or against, and he would always fight and form his plans around said weaknesses. Alas, he was still a human back then. He may have outskilled them, but he was still outnumbered and injured badly. Thankfully, he was no longer just any human. Now he was something more akin to a freak of nature, someone that far surpassed the strength, speed, and dexterity of regular humans. Now, he could carry out his plans much easier. The 7 Swordsmen of the Mist. Ken had already pinpointed their whereabouts. He could exact his revenge at any point he wanted, if he aimed to simply kill them. But simply killing them was not going to be enjoyable enough. Maybe at first, he would have been satisfied with spilling their guts on the ground with his bare hands. But now he had other plans for them. Alas, said plans required the wave of recruits to be trained for at the very least 2 more years. They were to play a part in his plan after all. The swordsmen would just have to wait for their turn to die. Ken also had a few plans for revenge on the Lord of the Land that put bounties on the heads of his family members. But he decided not to kill him at all. His family members were criminals, and that much was undeniable. Deserters were treated harshly in the Land of Iron, so Ken couldn't fully blame only the Daimyo. He would decide what to do with them after taking care of the Swordsman of the Mist. After all, revenge was a dish best served cold. Ken had always been a patient man. He felt no need for momentary satisfaction. The blind swordsman dashed through the woods with a smile underneath his mask. He wondered for a second whether to return to his base or go on a bit of a hike and hunt down a few bounties on his own. After a little bit of deliberation, Ken decided that he would first go home, get Tosho to prepare a few bounties for him to hunt down, and then leave on a mission. There was no need for him to stay at his base at all times after all. Tosho and Saburo were both more than capable of training the young recruits and Akira. In a twisted sort of way, Saburo had already become the jonin teacher that Akira had never had, as the strawman had a wealth of experience, and Akira was somewhat akin to a blank book. The situation was only somewhat twisted because Saburo had initially tried to kill Akira relentlessly, but the former thief-turned-assassin didn't hold it against him, so all was fine. Saburo had already managed to befriend Akira, but Tosho didn't seem to trust him one bit. Having more experience in life, he could tell that Saburo was as fake as a person could get. A man that would say anything and everything to make you feel better about yourself and to raise your opinion of them. Saburo clearly followed some hidden agenda, which was why Tosho simply couldn't allow himself to be comfortable around him. Ken was also well aware of that, but he knew that Saburo wasn't stupid enough to betray him. As long as their interests aligned, then everything would be fine. And if there happened to come the day when Saburo would act out, then Ken was confident he'd be able to put him in his place. It didn't matter how much he tried to hide his original body. The blind swordsman would always be able to find it. Ken didn't take more than 2 days to arrive back at his home. He stepped into the village with a smile on his face. Saburo's clones that guarded the entrance to the village simply nodded at him. Upon entering, Ken noticed that half of the recruits were busy being trained in the caves, while the others were in the field still training their bodies. Tosho really did pick children with potential. I guess he just got lucky. Not like he was selective. He accepted anyone that wanted to join, even children that were missing a limb among the recruits. Ken was able to sense 2 children that were missing an arm. One of them seemed to be blind in one eye, and another was surprisingly missing a leg. War orphans weren't always left unharmed by the war after all. Now, the child without the leg was a special case. Ken was going to make sure he received rigorous training, but he didn't plan on sending that particular child on any missions unless he managed to prove himself despite his disability. Ken didn't want the orphans he took in to end up dying in his care. It simply felt weird for him to just treat them all like resources whenever they always stopped their training to greet him. Many of them called him father. Ken had never had children of his own. Well, none that he knew of. But in general, he was a loner for all of his first life, and his only family were his father's in his second life. Still, his time with them had shaped him into the person that he became, which was also why he wanted to avenge them even more. One step at a time, no need to rush into things. Let all the pieces fall into place. Ken sat down in his office, taking off his mask and placing it to the side. His bangs now covered the part of his face where his eyes should have been. They weren't close enough to cover the two noseless nostrils that were standing a bit above his mouth. I think I'm due for a haircut, Saburo. Tell Tosho to come here for a bit. Ken spoke out as he shook his head and crossed his legs. Saburo wasn't in the room, but his clones at the door could hear him. He could feel one of the clones nod, but neither of them moved. Tosho arrived a bit later with a bit of dust on his clothes, having just come out of the caves from training the children. Master, I'm glad you're back so soon. I hope everything went well. Tosho took a knee immediately upon entering the room and closing the door, his masked face staring at Ken's expressionless face. Everything went smoothly, a lot better than expected even. We are now allies of sorts with the Land of Iron. Ken nodded as he spoke. I find it difficult to believe that the Land of Iron would become allies with a stray organization. Another voice joined in on the conversation, and Saburo entered the room with a curious look in his eyes. You can find it difficult to believe, but it did happen. Be it through intimidation or charisma, it seems that at the very least the nobles think we are worth keeping around more than otherwise. Ken wasn't bothered by Saburo's presence. He had expected him to show up as well. Akira was likely still training in the caves though. I see. I'd love to hear more about what happened in detail. Saburo nodded a bit. Tosho didn't say anything, but Ken could feel that he was also curious. I will go into detail at a later date. For now, I am feeling like taking a stroll, collecting a bounty or two in the process. Tosho nodded as he finally stood up, dusting himself off and walking to his leader's side. I will select a few interesting targets for you, sir. I actually had my eyes on one myself. Ken turned his head towards Tosho, smiling a bit as his curiosity rose a bit. You found something interesting among the bounty posters. Saburo also seemed a bit curious about what his associate had found. Not among the bounty posters, but I did find a personal request directed at us, asking us to investigate something called the Cult of Jashin. Tosho took out a small unsealed letter and placed it on the table. Cult of Jashin. EOV narration. Cult of Jashin. Ken asked as he supported his head on his palm, turning his head over to Tosho. Yeah. I don't know much about it yet, besides what the letter said. Tosho nodded as he brought Ken's attention back to the fact that it was a request rather than a bounty. Personal request from an anonymous sender, Saburo muttered as he rubbed his chin with a raised eyebrow. The Dark Brotherhood had not yet grown to the point where it should have received requests from others. It was rather surprising that they did, but Ken couldn't exactly complain about it, though it did bring up the possibility of it being a trap set up by an enraged noble. Not quite anonymous actually. It wasn't difficult to find out that it came from a few of the nearby villages. Our operations do at least give us some renown in the area. Tosho clapped his hands with a smile on his face. Plenty of people have reported losing relatives and friends, odd disappearances all over the place, all linked to sightings of weird masked people. With the local nobles not bothering to do anything about them, the villagers figured it would be worth it to pull together some money and hire our organization to look into this. Tosho had already done his research on the situation. He was glad to share his findings with his now interested teacher/master. So we're talking about an unknown group of people kidnapping others. How did they get their name? Ken rubbed his chin and tapped on his mask, which still lay on the table in front of him. Some of the villagers heard hushed whispers talking about some religious group looking to convert more people to their belief. They believe they are the ones tied to the kidnappings. The blind swordsman nodded when hearing that, his head tilting slightly as he pondered on whether or not to personally go after the strange religious group and investigate more about it at the very least. What do their beliefs consist of? Ken's curiosity stirred as he figured a cult in such a pragmatic and sadistic world would make religious extremists back in his world blush. Well, they weren't able to find out much, just that it had something to do with immortality. That was unfortunately where Tosho's information seemed to fall apart. Them in just about every other cult and religion in existence, it's always immortality, be it in this life or the next. Ken wasn't very impressed, but he didn't let his disappointment show in whatever features he had. It just meant that he would have to find out more on his own. But the little Tosho confirmed did manage to stir the curiosity of someone else in the room. Immortality. That's quite interesting. What else are you able to tell us about this cult of Jashin? Saburo spoke out with a diplomatic smile, clearly interested in learning more himself. Alas, Tosho didn't have any good news for him. I don't have much more information than that. I have not been able to find much besides the fact that their headquarters are somewhere at the border region between the Land of Hot Water and the Land of Frost. The First Blade had not managed to learn a lot about the cult. He hadn't been able to go out and investigate himself, so all he had to rely on was what the villagers that had commissioned him could tell. Is the location of the headquarters from a believable source. The villagers can't possibly know that Ken still wanted to make sure of a few things before proceeding with an investigation. He needed to know exactly what he had to work with. It was from a few traveling merchants. They claimed that people wearing similar masks to the one described by the villagers are spotted more often in those regions. Tosho shrugged, having already vetted out his sources. "It's a rather wide area to look into," Saburo said as he turned and looked at Ken, trying his best to read the child leader's thoughts. "Wide, but not too difficult for someone like me." Ken's senses and abilities as a sensor were likely good enough for him to spot the hideout if he was within a certain range. It wasn't difficult for his ears to pick up on human settlements, as nature was otherwise quiet most of the time. "I can help with a few clones, but I can't let them get too far from me. The range of my technique isn't endless." The strawman was not unwilling to share some of his weaknesses at that point. At the very least, he was willing to share things that he thought Ken had already figured out on his own. Ken also noticed that Saburo had become awfully interested in that cult after immortality was mentioned. He made a mental note of that before shaking his head and responding, "There's no need, I feel like going for a relaxing walk anyway." Ken slowly stood up, taking his mask and placing it on his face, covering his calm smile. "What if you need to read their texts or books in order to find information?" Saburo raised an eyebrow, somewhat confused at his leader's approach to the situation. At the very least, he acted confused. Inside, he was simply displeased that he wouldn't be looking into the matter personally. Unfortunately for him, there was no changing his leader's decision at that point. "I'll manage. I've always managed." Ken shrugged and stretched his arms a bit. Saburo looked at his leader before sighing and shrugging. "Suit yourself." He was smarter than to go and annoy Ken for too long. He would simply have to learn more after Ken eventually came back. "I'll be leaving in a day. I'll leave tomorrow at dawn. I'll need Tosho's help to write up a report about what happened during my visit to the capital." The blind swordsman waved his hand and dismissed Tosho and Saburo, both of them going back to their previous jobs. The former was to return later in the evening to help Ken write up a report about their deal with Yuchi. Saburo himself was also busy, as his laboratory was already close to completion, so now he could resume his previous research, at least parts of it. He hadn't given Ken many details, but he did say that he was looking into the human psyche, the ways Genjutsu affected the mind, and the permanent effects that trauma suffered during Genjutsu could have on a human. It was a rather grim experiment, and it obviously required test subjects, which Saburo was thankfully able to source from some of the bandit camps that he had raided. Ken had to build a small underground jail in him to hold his prisoners. It was connected directly to Saburo's lab, which made things much easier for the strawman. Saburo was actually quite glad to now be working with Ken, as he could now pursue his experiments openly, not needing to hide them from the village he worked for. Ken himself was not exactly a morally righteous individual. He seemed to not really care about the bandits that were being used as test subjects. He only made Saburo promise to give them all painless deaths after the experiments were over. The strawman readily accepted, as he didn't really care either way. It's extremely nice having an employer that sees the benefit in your research. That was also one of the big reasons why Saburo didn't wish to argue with Ken over the matter with the cult of Jashin. Even if he was now interested in finding out more about them, it wasn't in any way worth losing favor with Ken over it. The very next morning, Ken departed from the small village they had built with a smile on his face. Passing by and waving at the children that were still training in the courtyard was something he seemingly enjoyed doing. It did derail the training for a bit, as all of the children seemed very excited whenever they saw him. But it also did help them build some sort of affection with the recruits, as all of them appreciated the attention they received from their father. Saburo wasn't really fond of that particular tactic. However, he wanted Ken's presence to retain a bit of mysticism to the children that called him father. That mysticism would inevitably lead to the children looking up to and revering Ken more over time. Alas, Saburo didn't really have a say in the way the recruits were being trained, so he didn't ever speak out of turn regarding the matter. He merely watched through his clones as Ken waved at the children as he passed through the village gates. As soon as he stepped out of the village, Ken's hand fell to his side, and he immediately disappeared, taking off into the forests, not leaving even a full afterimage behind. Ken's departure was quick. He headed down beyond the border and into the land of hot water, hiding his presence, as he didn't want to bother encountering any shinobi along the way. He leapt from tree to tree, his steps not shaking the branches he walked on, as his speed made him more akin to a blur. The blind swordsman stalked the border between the land of hot water and the land of frost for the following days, keeping his ears peeled the entire time, as he silently advanced with his search. Rest was not really an issue for the natural-born sage. He could keep up his stride for what felt like an eternity. After all, one that could casually regrow limbs wouldn't have much of an issue with sprinting. Eventually, Ken could hear it, the sound of a crackling campfire. He had run into a few before, merely travelers and peddlers, but this one felt different. It felt bigger. It also brought with it an odd smell of burning flesh and smoldering bone marrow, though it might have been just an animal being cooked up. Ken didn't want to just jump to conclusions too quickly. Instead, he got closer and closer until he could clearly feel the situation. There it is. Ken crawled on top of a tree, settling his attention on what felt like a large gathering in the middle of the woods. Dozens upon dozens of what felt like masked men were gathered around a campfire, kneeling with their foreheads on the ground as the large campfire. On the bonfire was now the woman, Her guts seemed to be spilling down on the fire, as she was already burnt beyond any recognition. Ken couldn't see her state, sure, but he could easily tell from the smell after getting close enough. He was quite familiar with it at the end of the day. I guess they really are a mad cult. Huh? If that woman was one of the people they forcefully converted to their religion, then I can't really expect any one of them to be alive. Still, the blind swordsman was left pondering on what to do next. Should I try to observe them a bit more? Should I just kill them all and interrogate whoever survives? They all seemed to be huddled around the campfire, but behind them was a cave that Ken couldn't really feel into. Likely some sort of seal. Ken could still feel a few humans inside that cave, thanks to his nature energy, but he was completely unable to tell what level of chakra they had. There were bound to be some shinobi among them though. The odd part was that the people down below didn't feel like fighters or shinobi to Ken. They didn't have any chakra, signaling that all of them were civilians. Well, at least most of them were. However, one thing was for sure, every single masked person had an aura that Ken was very familiar with. Bloodlust fueled by a sense of crazed determination. They're all bloodthirsty maniacs. I should have expected this. The bloodlust he could feel from them reminded him of some of the maniacs he had fought in his past life, killers for hire. It was a playground for the mentally diseased. A playground that Ken ruled for the better part of 2 decades. I guess I'll watch them a bit longer. See if anyone more concerning appears out of that cave. Ken simply crossed his arms and sat down on the tree that was at least 5 kilometers away from the large bonfire that the cult had created. Whatever this cult is, I'll make sure to burn them to the ground. Since I'm already here, POV Jashinist, and as we knelt and prayed, we watched the woman's body before as it burned. I believe she was one of pure heart and body as well. A great offering to our Lord and one of our most important rituals. Offering a heretic to our Lord in hopes that we will finally be noticed like our leader was. Thankfully, there's no shortage of offerings. We are able to easily lure in more and more people to provide as offerings to their Lord. Some were kidnapped from faraway villages. Some were coerced into coming there on their own, and then drugged into submission. Most of our offerings are comprised of women and children. However, children sometimes get the opportunity to join us as well. The children were akin to a blank slate, still pure enough to be converted to our beliefs. Our church is ever growing, unbeknownst to anyone else. Some of us had tried to spread the word of Lord Jashin to some villages, but they never did manage to receive many recruits from that. Blasphemous pagans that lived without any purpose. Just thinking about their filthy existence makes me mad. I can barely wait for the day when we would finally be able to grow strong enough. Strong enough to spread chaos and death to this dirty world and its residents. Thankfully, we receive strength directly from their Lord, should he notice our efforts. Varying degrees and ranks within our religion receive different gifts from Lord Jashin. It is said that our leader has even achieved a state of semi-immortality. Lord Jashin only grants that gift to one person each generation. He truly is fit to be our respected leader. How wonderful it is to see our efforts be rewarded in such a way. Alas, we recruits have yet to receive our Lord's blessing. More blood must be spilt. Patience is something we must have, but not something we must ask of our Lord. We must shower him in offerings as is customary. Oh, there he is, our esteemed leader, Master Kaimuro, the shepherd to our damaged souls, wearing nothing more than a black coat, showing off his tattoos and the symbols that adorn his body. He even painted his hair white to match the depictions of our Lord Jashin. He has even appeared in the dreams of former leaders. A great man that has truly earned the right to wear the symbol of Lord Jashin on all of his limbs, and even on his tongue. Oh, devout followers of Lord Jashin, tonight he has spoken to me. Master Kaimuro spoke out to us, calling us devout. Such high praise for us unworthy followers. Hail Lord Jashin, hail Master Kaimuro. Our voices resounded throughout the praying ground. Our master nodded his head with a warm smile on his face. However, his smile soon turned upside down. A frown. Have we, unworthy followers, done something to displease our Lord? Our Lord has spoken. Master Kaimuro repeated himself as all of us quieted down, waiting for his words. Today's sacrifice was nothing more than a pathetic contribution. He has grown bored of such boring ways. Oh, a pathetic contribution, Lord. We apologize for all of the displeasure we've caused. We must atone for our sins. We must atone for our sins. All of us moved in a trained manner, already knowing our customs. We unsheathed our knives, placing a palm on the ground. We all stabbed into that palm, impaling it on the ground. The ground started turning red as all of my brothers bled for our collective sins. It is necessary to pay in earnest when displeasing our Lord, for he has given us so much, yet we can only provide him with so little. Such a way of praying for forgiveness. My devout followers, I commend you for your readiness and praise you for your unwavering faith. Master Kaimuro's words rang like a song to our ears as we bore through the pain. However, Master's next words immediately dampened our spirits. Lord Jashin will not be pleased with just this tonight. We have received his direct orders. To repent, we must slaughter a village of blasphemous pagans in his name. Master Kaimuro spread out his hands, opening up his palms and smiling warmly at all of us. Yes, Lord Jashin is giving us a way out, a way to repent for our sins. It shall be done, it shall be done. Our shouts echo throughout the forest as we all got up and started bandaging our bleeding palms. Tonight we shall lead many wayward souls to our Lord Jashin. Praise be. EOV King crazed cultists, the lot of them. Seeing them burn up a woman was crazy enough. Seeing them all plunge a blade into their own hands is something else entirely. People are always much more open to causing pain to others than to themselves. These people are too far gone, and that man leading them, Master Kaimuro, I don't know what his deal is, but it almost feels like he is dead for some strange reason. It's almost as if nature energy just doesn't stick to him for some reason. All living organisms must have nature energy inside of them, but for him, it seems to be constantly spilling out. One thing's for sure, he feels dangerous. He gives me a strange feeling of uncertainty. I'm not sure if I can fight him on my own. Even maybe I should have brought Saburo with me. I'm too late for regrets. But do I even need to fight this weirdo? The commission was not worth much money to begin with. At least nowhere near enough for all of this trouble. I do have a choice to make though. Letting these crazed cultists roam the world freely will definitely lead to a lot of innocent lives being taken. I wouldn't really give a shit if they only targeted shinobi, but civilians didn't sign up for their lives being put in danger, huh? Well, I guess I can deal with this branch at least. I'm assuming they have more, but I'm not going to search the world for cultists. I'm not that big of a busybody, though things might change if I get paid enough anyway. Since I'm here, might as well give these cultists a bit of a lesson on brutality. In the first place, I don't have to fight this weirdo in any way, I just have to kill him. Kill him in such a fashion that I strike fear into the hearts of all of the other dregs that are near him. With his death, they are bound to scatter like rats. After that, it'll just be a game of hunting down as many rats as I can. In my past life, there were plenty of people stronger than me, but they all still died to me. This situation isn't all that different. I can see that they're starting to head in one direction. Probably going for that village they want to sacrifice to their Lord Jashin or whatever. Better get some traps ready, just in case. EOV narration. And so, the blind assassin got to work easily tracking the large group of fanatics. And realizing the route they were taking, they were headed for the third closest village to their base, one that was obstructed by trees. A great spot for a slaughter. Unfortunately for the cultists, the ground would only be painted red with their blood. King quickly got to work, setting up as many traps as humanly possible halfway to the village. He didn't have the time to warn the villagers and evacuate them, but he didn't need to. At the end of the day, he only needed to kill the cultists, and that would be the end of it. Once the leader is dead, they're unlikely to continue with their march towards the village. Anyway, Ken used all of the metallic wire inside his bag, setting up trap after trap, throwables and nets, even resorting to pitfalls filled with sharp sticks. The holes were dug up in a hurry using his tail, but they were going to hold up. After all, the rest of the cultists were mostly regular humans, not even shinobi. Only 2 or 3 people besides the leader of the cult even had any chakra above genin levels, so Ken wasn't really concerned about them. The leader himself seemed to be wielding a weapon, a large 2-bladed red scythe that was tied to his wrist by a long chain that was wrapped around his arm. The blind assassin stalked the group for a while. He had also managed to count them finally. There were a total of 87 people. Ken knew that he needed to kill them all. Leaving even one of them alive would just lead to the cult rebuilding itself. Eventually, the time came for Ken to kill their leader. As they were reaching the place where he had placed traps, Ken stalked the trees until he was directly above the madman. With a flick of the wrist, a puff of smoke appeared, and a large windmill shuriken unfolded itself in his hand. A nice toy he had managed to buy at some point in his bounty hunting journey from a wayward shinobi. He even had a few of them custom made, since he found them particularly useful. Ken's chakra immediately flared up, and the windmill shuriken buzzed with life, spinning in his hand as it radiated lighting. With another flick of the wrist, the shuriken flew towards the leader's head, aiming to decapitate him outright. Just as the shuriken was about to cut into him, Kaimuro raised his hand and turned his scythe at an angle, blocking the projectile with relative ease. The shuriken slid off to the side, causing sparks as it came in contact with the mad leader's weapons. It then embedded itself deep into the ground, creating a rather sizable hole, as it only stopped spinning after a few seconds. Oh my, it seems we've got a rat. Kaimuro shouted as the Jashinists behind him all took out their weapons, consisting mostly of tantos. Kaimuro looked up only to raise an eyebrow as he didn't see anyone there. He turned around a few times, scowling as he prepared to disembowel whoever got too close to him. Above, on the branches, Ken had already moved his position. He moved his mask to the side of his head and quickly made a few hand signs. His speed was decent, but it was not all that great when compared to Jonin. Thankfully, he wasn't in any hurry. As he finished his hand sings, his chest flared up, and he brought his head back, before opening his mouth and spitting forward a gigantic fireball. Fire release. Great Blaze Ball. One of the techniques he had gained recently, it was extremely flashy and just as deadly. The fire immediately caught Kaimuro's attention, who raised his head and looked at it with a scowl. "You worms," quickly form a wall around me." He quickly ordered his men, who followed suit, protecting their leader with their bodies. The fireball hit the ground in front of them, and the ensuing explosion shook the entire forest as the trees around them fell to the side. Ken landed on the ground and wiped his mouth a bit, before placing his mask back on and tapping his wrist once more, taking out his long blade in a quick motion already unsheathed. Was that enough, I wonder? Ken walked forward carefully. The smoke was hindering his sense of smell, and the crackling of the fire was somewhat annoying his ears, but he could still feel that a lot of people had been burnt to a crisp, thanks to that jutsu of his. Just as he prepared to blow the smoke away with a swing of his blade, a scythe rushed towards him from behind the smoke screen. The blind swordsman wasn't taken by surprise at all. He simply leaned to the side and batted the weapon away using his blade. As expected, cockroaches don't die that easily. Ken then swung his blade in front of him with a lot of force, causing a large gale that blew Daimyo away, and revealed the area to everyone that was still to the side. There were dozens of burnt corpses. Cultists turned to charcoal. Still, just as many had survived, not being close enough to the explosion. Daimyo already had his side back, having used it to slow himself down. Now he was standing right where he had been when the attack had started. "ESK, you dare kill my devout followers. Lord Jashin will not forgive such transgression." Daimyo shouted in anger, as the cultists that should have been cowering in fear were only emboldened, all rushing towards Ken with their weapons out. As expected, you can't scare away madmen, Ken thought to himself as he parried a few knives, before swinging his blade and cutting into their wielders with ease, dissecting them as he dodged a red scythe from the side. The scythe lodged itself into the heads of one of the cultists, but no one seemed to care. They all continued rushing Ken with crazed expressions. "Stop moving around, you pest," Daimyo shouted as he tried to pull back his weapon from the head of the cultists. Ken just scowled underneath his mask, before he turned and made a quick hand sign. The ground underneath Daimyo shifted as the cult leader had just managed to pull back his weapon, grasping the handle in his hand. Alas, he only had time to look down before a clone of Ken impaled him through the chest with a chakra blade, pushing his heart out of his body and onto the dirt in front of him. The clone then exploded into a burst of lighting, further frying the cult leader as he was dying. The windmill shuriken that Ken had thrown earlier had just been a lightning clone. The fireball had been nothing more than a distraction to take Daimyo's thoughts away from the shuriken, and it seemed to have worked. I guess he wasn't much after all, the blind assassin thought to himself as he jumped up and dodged a few slashes from the fanatical cultists. The 40 or so cultists that were left didn't even notice that their leader had his heart gouged out. They simply continued attacking Ken with fervor, waiting for him to land. Ken, while in midair, started spinning more and more. As soon as he landed, the cultists tried attacking him, but it was too late. He had already gathered enough momentum, and a violent tornado quickly formed around him as he continued spinning. Dragon Twister, the tornado grew in size as it lifted all of the cultists off their feet and threw them into the sky. Ken continued spinning more and more, some of the collapsed trees also being pulled into the tornado and thrown into the sky. From a distance, it just looked like a small natural disaster. Then, Ken stopped spinning abruptly. He stood still in the eye of the tornado for a bit, before slashing down his blade, breaking the wind stream apart and the tornado at the same time. All of the cultists that had been thrown into the sky forcefully hit the ground, dying on impact as Ken dodged a few of their bodies in trees. And just like that, the cult of Jashin was exterminated. Ken proceeded to walk over to the leader's body, sensing it from up close as he tried to figure out just what about him had managed to creep him out. Even after his heart was gouged out, it still feels the same. Though he is certainly dead, there's no trace of his wounds healing in any way. Ken reached his hand down, wanting to feel the wound himself. Just as he did, the body moved, the red side slashing towards him at insane speeds. Ken managed to block it, raising his blade just in time. But Daimyo's other hand also moved, pulling a steel rod from his sleeve and thrusting it towards his chest. The blind swordsman managed to slightly bend his body, but the steel rod still stabbed into his shoulder. Ken rolled away as he narrowly avoided getting cut by the red scythe on his way out. What the hell? How can he survive something like that? Even I'm not sure if I could, hahaha. Curse technique. Death controlling possessed blood. Daimyo burst out laughing as he licked Ken's blood from the steel rod in his hand. The blood from his chest seemed to fall and form into a strange symbol on the ground. Just like that, Ken sensed a strange energy creating a connection between the two of them. Ken scowled at that. He prepared to dash forward, but the madman seemed to be just as fast as he was. Lord Jashin, I offer this heathen's blood to you. May it satiate your hunger. Daimyo raised his scythe and plunged it into his own stomach, smiling sadistically as he did so. Ken was shocked when he sensed that, but what shocked him more was the fact that he was forced to stop his advance, clutching at his stomach with a scowl on his face. He was so shocked, in fact, that he fell to one knee. A blue what? Ha 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 ha. You fool. To think you would try to face Lord Jashin's brilliance on your own. Foolish. The man then looked at the ground. At his feet was his heart. He smiled sadistically as he kneeled and looked Ken in the eye, before stabbing into it with his steel rod. Sleep tight. the mad cult leader said as he watched Ken's body go limp. EOV Ken, it's strange. Not feeling your heartbeat in your body, feeling your hands grow colder and colder as the supply of blood to your brain made your vision foggy. It's been quite some time since I've tasted my own blood like this. So much is coming out that I can't even keep it all in my mouth. However, despite the obvious blood loss and pain, it seems that my regeneration can keep up with this just barely. If this had been a year or two back, then I surely would have died from this. But as I am now, I can still hang on. If he stabs his heart again and does more harm to himself, then I might actually die. Apparently, healing a missing / burnt off arm is easier than healing critical damage done to your heart. This might be because the heart seems to also store chakra, which seems to somewhat conflict with nature's energy. You'd think that you'd be able to move away chakra in your own body freely, but something in my heart seems to want to keep some chakra in there constantly. I need to do some more research on this. I don't understand how his technique works still. I've never seen anything like it either. Is it some sort of sacrificial technique? Something that takes the life of the opponent away? Wait, is he moving still? Is this man truly immortal? It's almost as if he doesn't need anything to survive. He did defend himself from fire using his followers as meat shields. Would a surprise attack with flames actually be able to kill him? But what do I do when my opponent both can't die, and whatever I did to him happens to me as well? There must be a way out of this even now. I sense a string of unidentifiable energy connecting the two of us. It feels like chakra, but also not at the same time. It's broodier than usual. There's no use in fighting him while this energy is connecting us. It would only be a waste of time on my end, an exercise in futility. Oh, right, his blood forms some sort of circle, didn't it? Will our connection be severed if he leaves it? If not, then I'll have to play dead for a bit longer. Let's just hope everything goes well. POV narration. Kaimuro panted a bit as he looked at his opponent's dead body. Yet another offering to Lord Jashin, but at what cost? The cult leader looked around to see all of his disciples had already been killed. Maybe he could have saved them had he acted sooner, but he was unsure that he would have been able to take the masked assassin on without that surprise attack. And I thought we'd be safe if we stayed away from the 5 great shinobi villages. Every other worshipper of our lord that was under me is dead, all because of that trash. Kaimuro was frustrated and angry. His pious and determined spirit trembled in rage when seeing the mangled corpses of his devout believers. Alas, he managed to calm himself down. I'll surely get scolded for this. I need to quickly rebuild as much as I can. Kaimuro slowly walked away from the circle of blood, scowling as he did so. The symbol of Jashin that had been formed from his blood was a powerful technique. Jujutsu, a special type of jutsu that relied on curse-like effects which normally stuck to others. It was a rather esoteric and poorly researched art. But that was just because finding someone capable of jujutsu was extremely rare. So rare, in fact, that you would be able to count the people capable of performing cursed techniques on one hand. Now, the cult of Jashin and its high-ranking cultists were the exception to that, as they at least had a few dozen capable of performing jujutsu with the help of their god, Lord Jashin. Kaimuro was leading nothing more than a small branch of the cult. They were a very widespread religion which had managed to stay hidden for a very long time. It was only due to Kaimuro's bad leadership that people managed to track them down. It was a great failure on his part, which even he acknowledged. At least Lord Jashin will forgive me, for I have already spilt the blood of the one responsible for this. Normally, his cursed technique would have transformed the user's body slightly, turning their skin dark and creating white bone-like markings on it. However, Kaimuro already had those tattoos imprinted on his body, so it had no visible effect or difference. The branch leader slowly walked closer to the corpse of the assassin that had assaulted them, finally getting a better look at his figure. This runt Kaimuro got closer and closer, before raising his scythe and bringing it down towards Ken's back with bloodthirsty and ferocity. Hitting a corpse was not beneath the cult branch leader after all. Unfortunately for him, the corpse he was trying to stab fought back. As soon as he raised his scythe, Kaimuro felt a bit of pain. Then blood spilled on his face. Looking down, Ken had his blade raised and was already crouching instead of laying down. Before the arm with the scythe even fell to the ground, Ken went for the other arm, swinging his blade again. This time Kaimuro reacted and dodged out of the way, rolling backwards as his arm finally hit the ground. What? Are you also a follower of Lord Jashin? Kaimuro shouted as he held onto his bleeding stump, his tattooed face whitening slightly, as the foe he had thought dead was seemingly just fine. Shit, this guy's instincts are a lot better than I thought. Ken scowled a bit underneath his mask. Yes, indeed, this was merely a small test. Ken stuck his long blade into the ground and cracked his neck. The blind swordsman hoped to try and buy some time to think up a strategy against the immortal cultist. His immortality may be better than mine, but he can't actually heal himself. Or at least he can't accelerate healing. In the end, the most obvious strategy was also the simplest one: dismemberment and capture. If Ken could make him drop his guard by pretending to be a follower of Jashin, then things would certainly go much better. E-test, you call this a test? After murdering all of my followers, Kaimuro didn't seem too pleased with the idea. Those that aren't strong enough aren't worthy of Lord Jashin's love. Ken immediately entered his bullshitting mode, trying to use whatever information he had gathered from listening in on them to try and appear as one of them. Abui, which branch are you from? The mad cultist unfortunately seemed to be asking some hard-hitting questions. Ken couldn't just give him a random number or area where his branch was. Instead, he chose the safest option. If there are several branches, there must also be. I am from the main base, an emissary for Lord Jashin. I am to make sure that all of the lower branches have adequate members, and that their efforts are enough to please our Lord. I am also tasked to test the faith and power of each branch leader. I must say, I am quite pleased with your show of faith. You placed your trust into our Lord till the very end of our fight. King crossed his arms as he spoke, looking at the long blade that was still embedded in the ground in front of him. Main base, I was not aware of missionaries being sent to test us, and our fate's Kaimuro still sounded confused. He rubbed his chin a bit. He also seemed quite flattered at Ken's praise. The blind swordsman was sure to pick up on that. It seems that having his faith praised is most effective on this man as expected. It wouldn't have been much of a test if the branch leaders were made aware of it. This was meant to be a surprise. We were also told to kill all of the unfit members in the name of Lord Jashin. Ken turned his head slightly and pretended to look around the battlefield. I see. It's my bad for recruiting such unworthy disciples. Kaimuro nodded, closing his eyes and gritting his teeth. It is fine. Your devotion to Lord Jashin could be seen in the sheer number of recruits. My report will certainly be a positive one. Ken smiled underneath his mask as he continued to bullshit the man. But what will happen now? Should I start rebuilding right away? Kaimuro asked, his tone a bit confused as he went and collected his heart. You will start rebuilding, but not in this area. Rumors say that you've been a bit too high profile. Ken's voice gained an accusatory undertone as he pretended to stare at the cult branch leader with his arms crossed. Apologies. Kaimuro seemed to hang his head in shame, seemingly already aware of his own mistakes. You will apologize directly to our superiors and Lord Jashin. All branch leaders were called to the main base. I am to also act as an escort to make sure you reach the main branch safely. Ken continued on with the charade, wondering how to try and squeeze some more information out of Kaimuro. I'll extend this for as long as I can, gather as much information as I can, while he's still willing to talk. Even if I don't plan to go after them, having more information on them will be beneficial. At general gathering after the test. I guess it does make sense. The worst of us will likely be judged. Will the blessings of Lord Jashin be inverted as well? Kaimuro rubbed his chin after he placed his heart in his back pocket. Immediately, he gave a rather interesting piece of information, so this blessing can be retracted. I'm guessing he's referring to his immortality. I was not made privy to those details. Depending on the results, it is possible. It is all Lord Jashin's choice. However, I will put in a good word for you. Ken shook his head and continued building rapport with the madman. I see, thank you. Kaimuro smiled and nodded. His tone was honest, losing some of its previous insanity. Are we heading for Mount Shimatama right away? The cult leader asked as he started walking towards his arm, trying to collect it. Mount Shimatama? Worth looking into. Yes, Lord Jashin waits for no one. And you know it. Ken spoke out in a resolute tone, making Kaimuro smile even wider and nod. By the way, you never introduced yourself. Since you have a blessing, I'm guessing I already know you. Right, we are after all the chosen few. Shit, I can't really bullshit my way out of answering that question. Well, I could if I really tried, but he's giving me a great opportunity now. Don't think I'll get much more information out of him like this anyway. In the end, Ken chose to follow his instincts, to take the opportunity that was presented to him so graciously. Just as Kaimuro crouched down and went to pick up his arm, Ken kicked the blade that was in front of him. The sword came out of the dirt instantly, cutting through it with ease as it spun in the air and cut into the madman's legs, its exceedingly sharp edge making his legs fly off instantly. Kaimuro didn't even get the chance to react. He only felt himself slipping forward as he lost his balance before he was attacked again. The blind assassin caught his spinning sword in one hand and slashed away the remaining arm of the immortal cult leader. Well now, this was surprisingly easy. I guess there really was no need to fight you. Ken shrugged as he shoved the tip of his sword into the madman's mouth. The cult leader seemed to go mad at that point, trying to trash around, his limbs flailing by themselves as Ken started tying him up in metal chains. The blind swordsman also gagged him, wrapping the chains around and into his mouth with a deft hand. Peace and quiet, Ken sighed as he slowly started packing the cult leader's pieces and tying them to his torso. It formed a rather strange and morbid backpack for Ken to carry around easily. On one hand, Ken could have tried to extend the information gathering a bit more, but there was no guarantee that he would have gotten any chance as good as that one to dispatch the mad cultist. Kaimuro's speed and reflexes did seem to match his own, so it would have been a rather annoying waiting game to play. There was also the fact that the longer that charade kept going, the more the possibility of getting an answer wrong grew. And that would have certainly made the mad cultist put his guard back up. No use thinking about it anymore. our resident cult leaders already turned into a rather fine backpack. Ken strapped the Kaimuro backpack to his back before he started fleeing from the scene. It's only a matter of time before the shinobi of this land show up. I don't want them to get involved with them, at least not while carrying such an important research subject. Oh yes, Saburo is going to be extremely pleased with this. POV Ken before leaving the scene. I collected my traps and burned all the bodies in a large pile, to make things harder to track whoever might be looking for these cultists. The traps ended up going unused, but that can't be helped. I didn't think the madmen would completely forget about their initial objective and focus on me. Regardless, after burning the bodies till they were not distinguishable from firewood, I started my journey. It's already been an entire day. The best thing about traveling alone is the peace and quiet you get. The wind buzzing in your ears as you jump from tree to tree, speeding alongside breathtaking masterpieces of nature, has become one of my favorite pastimes. Sometimes I wish I could see them as well, but at this point, I've gotten used to my lack of sight. It actually makes my life a bit more enjoyable. Enjoyable as in, I can feel everything else a lot more vividly thanks to my lack of vision. I feel more alive. I guess that would be the word. Unfortunately, having enhanced hearing can turn into a downside at times. Or, put me down you heathen. Sometimes, the chain I used to cover the mouth of my backpack slipped off. My backpack must be a new model. It's quite intelligent and extremely loud, kind of like an alarm clock. I tried knocking this guy out a few dozen times at this point, but it seems he just won't stay unconscious. My guess is that being unconscious for him is basically like dying, since his body doesn't function like that of a normal human. So whatever is making him immortal is inadvertently making him impossible to knock out? Why do you always have to be so loud? My quiet voice sounds more like a frustrated teacher at this point. This ingrate that I am carrying on my back must be in the top 5 most annoying life forms alive. Well, alive is a strong word for him. Lord Jashin will never forgive such transgression against his disciples. You shall get divine retribution for this madness. His speech is always so grating on the ears. As if being loud wasn't enough, he must also be annoying. I don't see Lord Jashin coming to your rescue now. Not that I would be able to see him at all. Shem PH. It's just a matter of time before the main branch investigates this. Undoubtedly, they will find you and your associates. You shall make perfect offerings to appease Lord Jashin's rage. In all honesty, I think this idiot does make a decent point. Even after burning the bodies, they will still logically conclude that they belong to their cultists. His superiors will 100% trace him down after they realize something is wrong. And I doubt the villagers that made the initial request will keep quiet when questioned and tortured by madmen. This whole operation turned out to be a bit more trouble than it's worth by the looks of it. I might have to pay a visit to their headquarters myself. I wouldn't have any problems with them coming after me. But my recruits aren't quite ready to fight against some immortal lunatics. Saburo and Tosho would fend for themselves quite well. But if an army of cultists descends upon us, then protecting the children would be quite hard. What was that old saying? To remove weeds you need to pluck out the roots as well. Something along those lines. I didn't bother talking to my backpack anymore though. I just stuck a piece of cloth in his mouth and tied a chain tightly around his face again. So much better. Dealing with the cult of Jashin will certainly be dangerous, especially if they have more people like Kaimuro here. Well, I now know the gist of how their abilities work. I just need to prepare properly. As for any other abilities that may appear, I'll deal with them as I go. The fact that I almost died does make me a bit wary of going directly to them, but I have plenty of time to make a decision. I should continue going to base first. I'll have to talk a bit with Saburo, and maybe send him on a bit of a scouting mission to this Mount Shimatama. We'll need to first look into it and see where exactly it's located. So much work. EOV narration. An undying man. Akira immediately perked up, walking over to Ken as soon as he reported the situation a bit. Yes, also really loud and annoying. Ken nodded, and Kaimuro looked at everyone in the room with absolute resentment. They were currently in Ken's office. The blind assassin had placed the branch leader on the table as if he was a display piece. Around them were 3 masked people, each having a number of lines on the middle of their masks. His mouth was still stuffed, as Ken had had his fill of the immortal man's voice throughout the trip. He does look to be immortal, Tosho muttered as he took the man's heart and inspected it with a curious gaze. Saburo looked down on the immortal branch cult leader, both metaphorically and physically. Immortal, yet still ended up on our leader's table. I guess that's to be expected. The researcher had already started with his projects regarding Genjutsu, but now another opportunity presented itself if Ken granted him the right to experiment on their new prisoner. Research into both the source of that immortality and the techniques he was using was something that Saburo wanted to look into daily. Before he could even open his mouth to ask for permission, Ken turned his head towards him. I know what you must be thinking. And you don't just have my permission. I ask you to place this task on the highest priority and get started as soon as possible. Saburo smiled immediately underneath his mask, nodding his head as his mood skyrocketed. The blind swordsman slowly turned around and placed his mask on the table right beside the raving cultist. Kaimura's eyes widened immediately, both while trying to understand what the people around him were talking about, and when finally seeing Ken's true face. But he didn't have much time to process it, as the second he saw it, two masked men entered the room, placed a black sack over his head, and dragged him and his body parts away to the laboratory that was hidden underground. Then another masked man entered the room and walked up to Tosho, who just nodded and handed over the cultist's heart. "Thank you, leader. I'll look into him and come back to you as shortly as I can." Saburo immediately bowed as he spoke. Of course, it should be mentioned that the other branches of his cult might start looking for us after noticing he's gone, so the sooner you find out more about him the better. Ken also smiled, showing his canines to the three blades in front of him. "Wait a moment, leader. We aren't prepared to fight such an organization in our current state," Tosho interjected immediately, sounding rather concerned underneath his mask. Akira also nodded his head, seemingly agreeing with his fellow blade. "We are not going to wait for the cult to attack us directly. Their investigation might take a while anyway, so we have time to strategize." Ken rubbed his chin, his deformed face morphing into a thoughtful EXPISSION, though it was hard to tell. "Do we have any information on their location?" Saburo asked as he ran a hand through his black hair, swiping it backward. "They are located at Mount Shimatama. That's what I managed to gather from the immortal I brought in before capturing him." Ken nodded as he spoke, proceeding to sit on his chair and raise his legs on the wooden table. Mount Shimatama. Saburo immediately started brainstorming. The elemental nations were a rather large continent, and they had a somewhat complex geography. Thankfully, Saburo couldn't be called anything but well-studied. That is part of the Land of Lightning, if I remember correctly, somewhere off nearer to the sea than the mainland. The Land of Lightning was situated more as a peninsula, right near the Land of Hot Water and the Land of Frost. Ken had been there before, but he didn't have absolute knowledge of the land's geography. "That's a problem. I was going to ask you to send a clone or two to scout it out." Ken instantly sighed when hearing where it was located. "Yes, I wouldn't be able to stay here and research. I can't stretch out my clones that far." Saburo also sighed, knowing that he would have likely been their best bet when it came to resisting the strange curse technique the cult of Jashin was using. After all, his clones didn't bleed, they weren't truly alive. And as long as they didn't touch his main body, his clones would be able to fight the cultists endlessly. Finding out more about their immortality and curse techniques should be a priority. Ken shook his head, instantly prioritizing the research process first. "I can go and scout it out." The one to speak was the youngest among the blades, the third blade, Akira. "It's an extremely dangerous cult. I'm afraid they are beyond your capabilities." Tosho was immediately against the idea, finding that Akira was the only other agreeable member of the Blades. He didn't want to lose him, in short. Ken turned his head and stared at Akira, weighing his options for a few moments. He could feel the third Blade's determination. "Fine, you are to observe them from a safe distance." Ken ended up accepting, judging that Akira had already advanced enough in his technique to stay out of sight. At the very least, he's able to hide his presence for a few minutes. It should be good enough to help him escape if things sour. "Thank you for trusting me, leader. I will go right away." Akira didn't wait any longer. Saburo simply handed him a map of the Land of Lighting on his way out. "Be careful," Saburo said, causing Akira to nod with a smile under his mask. It felt nice, having people care about him. It was rather novel for him, as he had once been an orphan himself. Unfortunately, Saburo's true thoughts were far from caring. "We can't afford to lose such talented pawns in our current state. But if he can't handle this much, then he's not even a pawn worth keeping." As soon as Akira stepped out of the room, he turned into an afterimage and immediately left the compound, showcasing his speed, which was only rivaled/surpassed by Ken in the organization. The strawman observed the third blade leave through the eyes of his clones. Accounting for rest time, he should reach the mountain in 2 weeks' time. If he keeps up this speed. Saburo immediately calculated the time it would take for him to arrive. "Good, let us continue with our work until then." Ken clapped his hands, and Tosho simply nodded and went back to training the children outside. Saburo also bowed slightly and left the room, surely eager to finally start experimenting on an immortal subject. Ken sighed after seeing them leave. He immediately started strategizing on a game plan. "We can't face them head on. You also can't quite assassinate an immortal opponent." Ken rubbed his chin for a few moments before remembering a rather crucial detail. Fire. Fire was something that even the immortal man he had captured seemed to be afraid of. Otherwise, why would he have asked his disciples to block his fire style just with their bodies? And it did make sense as well. After all, they seemed immortal, but they had merely achieved some sort of semi-immortality. They couldn't regenerate, so if we turn them to ashes, then the fight is done. Even if they could still live as ashes, somehow, they would just be dust in the wind. But there was also the problem of information. Not knowing how many immortals there were was concerning, and Ken was sure he couldn't fight all of them if they were as strong as Kaimuro. It was clear that assassinating them wouldn't be easy, especially since fire was relatively easy to notice. I need allies, someone to call upon for aid. The first person that came to mind was the Land of Iron. The Daimyo did owe him a favor for saving the little princess that one time, but the Land of Iron would never agree to send its samurai to a foreign land. It would be akin to a declaration of war to the Land of Lightning, simply not something I can ask for. That was the one glaring issue with the situation. No matter how much the Daimyo owed him, it would simply be unfair to ask so much of him. It would break any amicable relationship that they might have had. There's always that, well, I'll have to make a trip personally, it seems. Ken sighed as he tapped his fingers on his mask. Better get to it quickly. I might even catch up to Akira along the way. And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part, so be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, we'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out my other anime videos.